Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Mark Brandenburg. I'm the Environmental Resource Program Manager for St. Johns River Water Management District, and I want to welcome you all here for this training session, which is an advanced training session for the Uniform Mitigation Assessment Method, specifically as it applies to mitigation areas. And it's part of efforts for consistency in the application of UMAM, not only across St. Johns River Water Management District, but across the state as well. This training session today and tomorrow, we've invited not only consultants and Water Management District staff, but we've invited other water management districts, the Army Corps of Engineers, DEP staff, and local government agencies as well. So this is kind of an attempt to see if we can become more consistent in our applications. A few housekeeping items before we get started. First off, please, if you have not already, sign in the back. There is a sign-in sheet. So if you have not done that, sometime before you leave, please do. Second thing, please turn off all your cell phones and pagers. Actually, does anybody use pagers anymore? I think we can eliminate pagers like fax machines. There are no pagers anymore. But please turn off your cell phones. We don't want to hear your Superman theme ringtone or anything else go off during this session, please. Bathrooms are just right outside the door, and we are recording this, audio recording it. So just to let you know, if you have any questions or whatnot, we do want to make this interactive, so at any time during the presentation, if it applies to one of the slides that we're discussing, make sure that you raise your hand and we'll address it. But again, just want to make sure you knew that this is going to be recorded, and the slides with the audio will be placed on the website at some point shortly after this presentation so that you can refer back to it, or if people who couldn't make it today would be able to access the presentation. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our actual presenter today. We have Calvin Alvarez, who is the Bureau Chief for the Bureau of Mining and Minerals Regulation with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Calvin.
How about now? Can everybody hear me? All right.
One other thing, if you do have questions, raise your hand and I'll come to you because we want to be able to record your questions and answers. So.
How is everybody?
Hi.
Hey. So recently found out about this training and got volunteered last week. So I hopefully I will do okay with everybody. But if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them as we go through the material. Hopefully I'll hit everything that I'm supposed to hit. As far as the concerns or anything else, so Mark and Michelle will bring up anything that I miss. And how you doing, Mike? So, like I said, I'm Calvin Alvarez with the DEP. Currently, I'm with the Bureau of Mining and Minerals Regulation, where we deal with oil and gas exploration. We deal with gyp stacks, fertilizer plants, and mining. So I do still deal with UMAM on a day-to-day basis, typically. So, anyway, hopefully I'm not too rusty. But before that, I was the new Connie, the mitigation policy and UMAM person. I replaced Connie, and then Connie came back and replaced me, so she was the new Calvin, which was the old Connie. But anyway, it got very complicated. But I'm the Connie fill-in today. I know you can't tell us apart. I'm just as slim as she is and everything else, but it's true. As I go through these, you'll notice I'm a little rusty. Please don't take advantage of my compromised state, if you would, but let's go through it. So, why are we here? Essentially, no net loss of wetland functions, and that's what we're talking about. That's what mitigation is to offset. So, no net loss. And of course, the pertinent sections that we're applying is the Basis Review Applicant's Handbook that you guys operate out of here. It's the Applicant's Handbook. So, we're also here to talk about mitigation and how to accomplish that goal, and in part how UMAM relates to that goal. But I want to make sure you understand UMAM's place. UMAM's place is at the end of the line. Okay, so don't forget that. A lot of folks, when UMAM came online, a lot of folks took the Basis Review, the Applicant's Handbook, and they kind of put it down. And really, you shouldn't do that. You still need all the stuff in there. UMAM, the only thing it did was replace the ratios portion in the Applicant's Handbook. All right, so does everybody get that? That's where UMAM belongs. And usually if you have a problem with UMAM, you get there and you have a big issue with it, it's typically because you haven't done what's in the Basis Review and Applicant's Handbook. You haven't looked at that stuff appropriately. So take the time. Don't forget where UMAM fits in this whole type of thing. Don't forget your environmental conditions for issuance. Don't forget elimination and reduction of impacts. Don't forget to look at appropriateness of mitigation. And when you finally get to UMAM, if you look at the environmental conditions for issuance that you have and the analysis that the applicant's handbook tells you to do, when you get to UMAM, you should have all the answers you need to plug in there. So, very crucial thing. A lot of people jump to UMAM first. You can't do that yet. You have to do the other steps. So I just wanted to, if you really remember anything today, that's kind of the key thing right there. Oh, I turned it off. Here, all right. I'm glad that comes back on. All right, so I already mentioned this. It's to be done after reduction and elimination is done. After you do that to the greatest extent possible, then you can move on to see what offsets that. So what are we offsetting? Ecological value. And I like this definition because this definition has survived unchanged in various statutes and rules, and I find that to be utterly amazing that it hasn't been messed with over the years and in the different rules. So that thing has remained the same. If you're confused about what functions and to what level we're talking about, we give you a couple right there in the definition. So a good one to know, that's what we're measuring. So how do we accomplish this? Well, the four forms, creation, restoration, enhancement, or preservation, similar to those being impact. Why? Because you don't have to unbundle the functions. I mean, you got like for like, as best you can do that, that's where you want to go. Less arguments, everything else. Basis of Review and Applicant's Handbook says it doesn't have to. It says generally it's best accomplished by. So anyway, key thing to remember there. So ecological communities. And this is a kind of a part one type of thing. When you finally get to UMAM, this is how to describe it. Now, UMAM says, pursuant to that rule, 0.400 parent 1E, says that you have to use flux. You have to designate what it is pursuant to flux. This is a carryover from ERP. It fits real nice in a database. Flux works well for that. The problem with flux is that it's a land cover system. You know, it's not a native or natural community description. So we strongly suggest, and it's in the rule that you may use these other things, but we strongly suggest that you use another type of description along with your flux. For instance, if I just say to Matt here, you know, I'm looking at a 621, and Matt immediately thinks of cypress. Well, he doesn't know if it's a dome, he doesn't know if it's a strand, he doesn't know if it's a slough. But if I tell Matt 621 basin swamp, he should in his mind go to cypress dome. That's what it is. Because what you're trying to do right now, whether you're a consultant trying to make something for the agency, or you're a reviewer looking at this, you want to give everybody and let everybody know where you started, and that's the key point here, is what ecological communities am I starting with? Part one is very, very important to folks. So usually when I was the UMAM guy, people would call up and they would go, oh, I say it's a 4, he says it's a 7, who's right? And we would get on the phone. And I said, well, what's your part one? What's your optimal native community type? Where'd you start? Now here, just shuffling the papers, going, hold on, wait a minute, it's here somewhere, and finally, eventually, they'll tell me. So one guy will say, well, it's this, and the other guy will go, what? It is not. It's this. And then they'll spend about 30 minutes arguing, and once they get done arguing, their points, margins, go to about one of each other. So they were starting in different places, nine times out of 10. So it's very, very important. You make sure you tell people where you're going to start. To do that, FNA came out with the revised Natural Community Guide in 2010. They updated it free online into PDF form. So I encourage you to go there. Another guide that you could use is the FWC's Communities Conservation Guide, sorry. And you'll see, you know, even on the DEP site, on the mitigation portion of our site, you'll see little tools that you can use So I encourage you to go through those, because again, what you're trying to describe to people is the place you started, and what is the basis of your scores when you get there. Okay, so this is all applicant's handbook stuff. So if the impact assessment area has been degraded from the historic condition, the historic community type should be targeted for mitigation. So does everybody know where that part is? It's in 12.3.1.1. So 12.3.1.1, if you look at that. Now, there's a little bit of nuance there when we get to a little bit further on, but if it has been degraded from historic condition, in other words, if it's a pine plantation going into a prairie, for mitigation, I want a wet prairie back. So if it's tie encroachment up into a pitcher plant savanna, I want the pitcher plant savanna back. So that's the type of thing that we're talking about there. Oh, can you hear me? Other community types are okay if it offsets the impacts and results in greater ecological value. So take a look at that. And then this is also a little reminder at the bottom there. Not always can you offset the impacts. So it's in the applicant's handbook 12.3. So take a look at it, just a little reminder that it's there. Okay, here's where the little nuances come in. For artificial communities, you're going to refer to the native community type it most closely resembles. And that's in altered systems as well. In 2007, there was a change to the UMAM rule to clarify what we're talking about, because we clarified more closely that we're talking about optimal native community type. That's where we want to start. And we also clarified that if you have an artificial system or an altered system, you're going to refer to the native community type it most closely resembles. Now, I want to say you only get to this part in UMAM by evaluating one of these things if you required mitigation for it to begin with. All right, so keep that in mind. That's why I said you got to get through all of that before you get here. So, and we came out with a memo in 2011, which kind of further a little clarified that. Analysis and function shall be used as a reference. So same type of thing. What you're looking there for is the functions. So altered communities. Here's where it gets a little dicey. You're going to have to think about this on a case-by-case basis, and you're going to have to go into it. So like I mentioned before, most people, especially in the panhandle, when you're looking at fire suppression, tie comes up out of the tie swamp, which is a very narrow little fringe on the edge of a strand, comes up, and it'll take over the slope, all right, into the pitcher plant savannas. Now, as I mentioned before, I want the savanna back. I don't want a tie. And most people, when they look at it, will not start as a tie as a reference community. Most people will go for the pitcher plant savanna or the wet prairie. So what really, really confuses people most of the time, I find, is when it's a native tree there, people sometimes have a tendency to go to whatever that native tree is. If it's a melaleuca or Brazilian pepper, they don't go there. But if it's a slash pine sitting there or a tie, sometimes their mind kind of goes there. So think about that. If it's altered due to fire suppression, altered due to planting of slash pine, what have you, you're going to want to look to see if that has changed a lot. Now, if it's changed so much from its historic community, you might want to see if this is a self-sustaining thing. I came across a system down in Bonita Springs, Florida, and it used to be cypress. All right, so it was cypress, melaleuca invasion all through there, through the system and around the system that I was looking at. Cabbage palm started to come in there. It's been drained over the years. But what a farmer did is they came in and they made berms going around in a rectangle. And up in that berm, inside the berms, he put furrows and beds, just like he would for normal ag. It sat for a good 20, 30 years. And there now was thalia, pickerelweed, maiden cane. Had 3 melaleuca trees of substantial size up near, this corner here. Adventitious rooting, water stains, 14 inches above grade, crawfish burrows every 10 square feet. Feeding in it were roseate spoonbills, wood storks, that sort of thing. So what I had there was a self-sustaining system. It was a rectangular marsh with a corrugated bottom. That's kind of what it was. It wasn't a pristine marsh, but it wasn't a bad marsh. But it certainly wasn't the cypress system that existed there before. So, that's sort of an easy example, but this is what it's telling you to do. Just kind of step back, slow down, and take it on a case-by-case basis and see what you have. So before you even get to UMAM, though, when you look at the environmental conditions for issuance that you need to address before you get there, when you look at wetland conditions and the functions that are adversely affected, you're probably going to figure this all out before you ever get there, because those are the functions that you need to replace. All right, temporary activities. Generally, what you see is what you get. So when you look at current conditions, temporary activities come up from time to time. And especially when you're talking about ag and silviculture. All right, so let's take ag, for example. General thing, especially down in South Florida, take an area, clear it for agricultural purposes, put a fence around it, get your ag exemption while you take your, try to get your permits. Smart thing to do. So a general thing to do. Now when staff comes on there and the consultants or whoever you are is trying to do the UMAM on these things, you have to ask yourself, well, gosh, where do I start? Do I start now with the cows on it? What condition do I start with? So ag, temporary activity. So temporary activity, cattle grazing is here. You've got a cow-calf operation that's been there for about 2 years or so. So what I always tell people is consider those cows, if they were taken off the land right now, what would happen? So what would happen to that pasture? What would happen to that? Let it grow up in your mind. Look at the species that you have on the ground. Look at the ground cover. Look at everything. Imagine in your mind that grows up. And what will you have? Well, typically, if it's only been there for about 2 years, a lot of the stuff is going to come back. Okay? So it's a temporary impact. However, if those cows have been there for about 40 years, if you let it grow up today, all that stuff isn't going to come back, now is it? So it depends on how long those cows have been there and what condition that the wetlands or your assessment area is in. So just take that into account when you look at systems like that. Another thing to look at is cyclical operations, such as pine plantation, silviculture. So generally, it depends. The scores depend on a lot of things. How bad did they treat the ground before they did it? What was their prep work? Did they bed and furrow? Did they use a lot of herbicide? Did they not? Did they burn from time to time? What are they growing the trees for? Is it for paper? Is it pole? Are they on a third both end? Are they not? These things go in huge cycles, throughout many, many years. So it depends on what sort of cycle that they're in when you look at that. Still, silviculture is a temporary land use. So what we usually do is, well, what's the average cycle? If you predicted this thing to be in an average cycle, what is that going to look like, and grade it, on an average as you go through there. So these things are a little tricky, but when you look at them and you go to assess the functions and everything, think about it that way. Any questions on that? Okay. And just a little note down there, I think Connie put clearing is not the same as silviculture. I don't know. Okay. I agree. Mitigation proposals. As I said before, UMAM did not replace anything in the applicant's handbook and the basis review besides the ratios. So if you go to section 12.3.3, you're going to see in there a big, huge list of things to include in there. So just because UMAM came out and it says, hey, we need all the information in order to verify everything in this rule, don't forget about this thing. This thing still exists, it's still there, still required. And if you follow this, if you give everything in there, this is essentially what UMAM is asking for in large part, you'll probably hit it. So anyway, don't forget about this thing. Okay, and especially I think the management plan is a big, huge one, I think, from what your standpoint is here, Mark. So anyway, don't forget it's there. Appropriateness and location. So there's a difference between where we start and where the Corps starts in our rules. Their 2008 compensatory mitigation rule has a hierarchy. First, banks, in lieu fee, watershed approach, permittee responsibility, mitigation after that. We tend to start on site and then we move off. So both rules, however, keep in mind, both rules have flexibility to move on and to move off. So theirs starts off, has the flexibility to move on. Ours starts on, has the flexibility to move off. At the end of the day, we typically find a way to get the mitigation done and to select the best project that's out there. So just kind of keep that in mind. Usually it's the greater improvement and the long-term viability of the site that gets us. So even though this is in the applicant's handbook, we use banks every day. We go off-site every day. So look at that. And the last one is mitigation banks can be an appropriate mitigation option. All right. Appropriateness. Am I going too fast? Am I going too fast? No? All right. I haven't gotten to the good stuff yet, apparently. Does mitigation serve to offset the functions being impacted? So by the time, I keep on beating this dead horse, but by the time you get to UMAM, you should know the answer to this already. So, and UMAM is very, very clear that it doesn't address appropriateness. So, when I was doing this, I would get calls all the time of, I can't get UMAM to work, and I would say, why? Explain it to me. So when they explain their project, they haven't done the appropriateness step yet. So they immediately launched into UMAM, forgot all the other stuff, and that's where they were having problems. So that's really, really key. Look at the type and function and the quality of the functions that you're going to be looking at, and you should have everything before you go into it, all right? So, preservation and appropriateness. Is preservation mitigation of altered communities appropriate? So we're not talking about enhancement. We're just talking about slapping a CE on a pasture, slapping a CE on a pine plantation or an orange grove, which I found to be fascinating. Not grapefruit, but orange. So, is this appropriate? I guess this is one of the questions that came up. No. So, if you go back and look at the applicant's handbook again, and look at the section on preservation, it says preservation of important ecosystems can provide an improved level of protection over current regulatory programs. So it has always been important ecosystems is what we're looking at. We're looking at not taking non-important ones, I guess you could say. In the memo that we did in June of 2011, it also references important ecosystems. So it's always meant that preservation, in whatever the form, deed restrictions, conservation easements, whatever, it's always meant that these things are supposed to be important. Okay, so just remember that when we go forward. On the same regards, preservation, mitigation of degraded native community appropriate. Same deal. They have to be important ecosystems because that's what it's supposed to be. That's kind of the, I don't know, sometimes they refer to it as the importance test. It's every time you look in the basis review and applicant's handbook, you see some sort of test, but that's kind of what we're shooting for and what we always have. And does getting more acreage make it appropriate? Typically no. So it usually, if you give me a bunch of non-important systems, okay, that's great, but what functions does it offset? And you might be able to get one or two, but you aren't going to get the whole suite that you need to go there. So just remember, important ecosystems is what you're looking at there. All right, so this is kind of a big one. This is going back to the purposes of the conservation easement, and specifically as it relates to a large part of the 25-foot upland buffers that we get. So the question is, can you get mitigation credit for a 25-foot upland buffer? Minimum 15, average 25, going around there. And while you certainly have a safe harbor from secondary impacts if you put this buffer there, from an impact standpoint, do I give mitigation credit for it? If that all that is a 25-foot upland buffer that you're giving, you're going to have a hard time kind of making the case there. And the rules say that it may also be appropriate as mitigation. So there's that 12.2.3 in the applicant's handbook. But you have to kind of think about this one. That's why it says may. You have to think about it. If you're giving a conservation easement or something which, say it's a big sandhill or something that is important to that wetland, if it's of a magnitude, then yeah, that could count for it. If it's a 25-foot upland buffer, next to somebody's pool that's, between it and the wetland, maybe not. So it's open. It says may, but typically for 25-foot upland buffers, I can say around the state, usually that's not the case.
So what is appropriate then?
Oh, it certainly depends. What is appropriate? Well, give me an example. Oh, I'm sorry. I can toss this thing around too.
Just say like pine plantation up here. Typically we're doing developments here in North Florida where the district's requiring a 25-foot buffer. We usually get credit for that under UMAM. Now you're saying developers aren't going to get credit for that?
And what I'm saying is they may get credit for that. You have to see, you
I
get...
think you're dodging my question. It's either a yes or a no question, isn't it?
No, not really. If the 25-foot upland buffer does something to give you a lift in that adjacent wetland, all right, because we're talking about the upland buffer. If it does something, and you can show the agency, look, by me preserving this little piece, this is what it does for that associated adjacent wetland, then you can get credit for it.
Typically, usually that's giving filtration, runoff, and everything else to those wetlands. All the herbicides, pesticides are getting filtered through that 25-foot upland buffer before it gets to the wetland.
So will you have a 10% increase in water environment to that assessment area? Because that's what UMAM is asking you to do. Do I at least have a 10% increase in water quantity and quality as a result of that upland buffer?
How are we supposed to quantify that? Is that just going to be a random thing that we say, we argue, we debate that with our reviewer?
Well, you would have to debate it with your reviewer, but I'm just saying that in South Florida, Water Management District and other water management districts, you typically will not get mitigation credit for that.
Well, up here, we've been getting mitigation credit. Is the DEP saying now that we're not?
No, I'm saying that you may, but you're going to have to justify it.
If it's buffering a wetland, can we say that's mitigation? If it's not?
If it's buffering a wetland.
If the upland buffer.
Oh, sorry.
Is adjacent to a wetland. If the upland buffer is adjacent to the wetland, will we get credit for that? Is that a?
Well, it has to be adjacent to the wetland.
Okay, well, you were just saying if there's a pool in between it, we weren't, that's.
Hello? Ah, there I am. I'm back on. I'm just saying if you have a pool, a 15-foot wide strip there at that particular point, and then you have your wetland. Now that buffer, what does it do for you at that point? I mean, it certainly prevents secondary impacts, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it also depends on how big that wetland is and what it's doing there. So what I'm saying is that it may, the rule is certainly open to it, but typically that's a very, very hard thing to do, is to say that now my water environment is increased at least by 10%, both quantity and quality, because of that upland buffer. Yes?
I thought the upland preservation,
Oh,
the thing with upland buffers was denning and nesting habitat for aquatic and wetland dependent species.
sure, that's part of it.
So if you don't have that, if you eliminated the buffer all the way around and you bought a little bit extra mitigation at a bank, wouldn't that wetland be degraded?
Let's say that again.
If you eliminated the upland buffer because you didn't have that much uplands to start with,
Gotcha.
and you opted instead, your client said, I'd rather buy a half accredited a mitigation bank
Mm-hmm.
and have no upland buffer. would the wetland then be somewhat degraded due to the lack of the buffer?
You would look at secondary impacts to that wetland right now.
So it'd be impacted.
I mean, essentially, that right there is saying if you have that, the agency is not going to consider secondary impacts. It's not that impacts didn't happen to that wetland. What we're saying is we're not going to consider it by rule. I mean, you could still have impacts to that wetland, but they're acceptable. I mean, that's what we're saying. But I mean, that's a key point to remember is we're not going to consider secondary impacts to that. Mark said this would be a tough one.
Well, it makes up a lot of our point.
Right. But anyway, it's a may. It's a may. Two-step approach. Is this a good one too? Okay, all right. That's a good one. All right, the one-step, two. Yes.
I just don't think we should move on.
Oh, okay.
Until you get this resolved. All right, so for clarity then, because as you said, this is a very important point to all of us in this room, and I think the silence that's going on is probably
I hear
more
mumbling.
disbelief than satisfaction.
Okay.
What I think I heard you say, and maybe you can clarify, so is the idea that if the buffer does nothing more than prevent secondary impacts, then you will get no mitigation credit for that buffer? Is that what you're saying?
No, I am saying that the rule says that you may, not that you always do, you may get credit or appropriate mitigation. It may be considered appropriate mitigation for conservation easements over wetlands, uplands, required to prevent cumulative or secondary impacts.
Right, but I want clarity then as far as when will we get mitigation credit? You're saying you may, and it's a debatable issue. Well, you can ask the reviewers that sit here that deal with this with us every day, and the typical scenario is kind of like what you described. There's a swimming pool, and then 25 feet of preserved upland buffer that was required to prevent secondary impacts, and then a wetland area that's, let's just, I mean, this scenario is so frequent here that you have that why can't we just answer that question right now with some discussion about it and tell me what does it take beyond preventing secondary impacts? What does it take for me to be able to say that I can have mitigation credit?
Well, do us a favor. Give us a hypothetical of when it would be, and then give us another one when it wouldn't be. I think Mike is asking for some details, like if it's a 15-acre wetland, or if it's a ditch, obviously it wouldn't be. Can you give some scenarios so we can try to get a bright line test defining when
Sure.
it wouldn't be?
I would say that if you're preserving beyond the 25 feet, I mean, if I'm looking at preserving uplands that relate directly to the hydrology of the adjacent wetland, all right, it's greater than 25 feet. You're taking it all, and you're saying, hey, look, because the local guys are making me do it. Something. I don't need all that land. I'm putting it under a conservation easement, and it's not going to be developed. Then I could say, well, that has a direct link to those adjacent wetlands. All right. I'm not getting into size yet, but you can see. I'm relating it directly to the adjacent wetland and the associated wetland. And does that make sense? Does everybody see where that would be beneficial?
Seems arbitrary.
Yeah, it's ecology. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. You have to look at everything on a case-by-case basis. Everything in ERP is a case-by-case basis. So I'm telling you is, I can't tell you 25 feet, I can't tell you 50 feet, I can't tell you 75. I can't give those sorts of bright lines here. But what I can say is that if you can put something, or you put something in a conservation easement over, whether it's uplands or wetlands or whatever, you can get credit for it. But the bar has to be high.
What I'll just say is, if you can provide appropriate documentation to back up why the upland buffer should be given credit. Could be used for nesting or denning, et cetera, and so forth. Any of those items, if you can provide that information, and it might then very well, I'm not going to again say 100%, but more than likely, then that could then be given credit.
But isn't it a given fact right now, there's so much literature on, you put an upland buffer on a wetland, it provides shelter to secondary impact, developers should get credit for it. Now we're debating whether it does or not, are we past that? An upland buffer does.
No, you got to have a 10% lift in there. I mean, you got to remember UMAM. UMAM is a chainsaw. I mean, it measures in 10% chunks. So you got to do that. You got to remember. I don't know if I gave you your bright line yet or not, but no. So some things in ERP are not bright.
I think you've made it worse.
Look, ladies and gentlemen, the rule says may or may not. Ain't no way in the world you're going to get a bright line. That's what the rule says. Allows you to choose between one and the other. So you're just going to have to convince them. If you don't convince them, you don't get it. I don't know what else you could ask for. It's there in black and white.
Oh, thank you. Look, just provide the documentation. I mean, from what I understand, it was a given before, and what we're saying is it's not a given now. Is that? I guess that's a fair statement of where we are. So just think about it.
Calvin, real quick. One thing that, right now, of course, I'm sure most of you are aware that the statewide ERP rule is being developed right now. And
Good point.
As you've mentioned, Calvin, a lot of the other water management districts do not give credit for that 25-foot upland buffer. It is actually your mitigation area. If the on-site is actually used for mitigation, you use that 25-foot upland buffer to provide a little extra potential lift in the area itself. But if it's just being preserved, you may or may not get credit. Well, in the other districts right now, several of them do not give credit. So as part of the statewide ERP, I think that is something that will be clear once the rule has been finalized. And I can't unfortunately tell you that that's going to happen today, but I would say within the year when we have the statewide ERP out, that will become clear, whether that should be considered appropriate or not.
Notification of all those statewide meetings are going to be on all the districts' websites?
As well as DEPs. I think Tim already setting that up. So, all right. Two-step? Okay. Two-step. Assigning credit for preservation of an assessment area first, and then assigning an enhancement credit at some point in the future. So what we're saying is please use the one-step approach, when you do this. This has been an issue for a number of years between the different water management districts and DEP. So our guidance here on this is figure out exactly what it is and then go with that method. I mean, think about what your project actually is. Is it preservation with a management plan dealing with a little bit of stuff? Where's your biggest bang for the buck going to come from? And when you figure out where's your biggest bang for the buck is coming from, is it removal of threats, or is it the enhancement that goes along with that? That's where you start with. So, yes. Oh, he needs a...
Question?
Well, you can't decide that until you know whether the agency is going to take your management plan and include that as a component of preservation, or whether the management plan is actually going to be considered as enhancement. Because if the management plan includes burning, and the property hadn't burned since before my grandfather's grandfather, then in my opinion, it ought to be enhancement.
Right.
And if it is enhancement, then you get a lot more credit out of enhancement. But if you include that burn plan in preservation, and you don't give enhancement credit for it, then on large mitigation banks, I'll preserve everything from tail to teacup, and I won't spend any money on enhancement because you're not going to get enough difference in lift between the two.
Okay. Run it both ways. I mean, run it both ways. That's what I always tell people to do. If you run it both ways and see where your biggest functional gain is going to come from, that's probably what you have.
If you don't establish what the burn plan does, whether it's enhancement or preservation, it totally changes both calculations. You cannot do it without getting the agency input, or at least
Absolutely.
talking to them about it ahead of time.
Yeah, you got to do a pre-app. I agree with you. I agree. Any more questions on this one?
Yeah. One thing we wanted just to make clarification on this, in this particular instance on this two-step approach, has been in the past where pine plantation has been preserved, and then at later, some point in the future, they'd come in and enhance it by removing. That is what we're referring to here, especially in the fact that, okay, well, we already mentioned earlier that pine plantation alone would not be appropriate for mitigation without some form of enhancement. So this is basically almost kind of saying the same kind of thing, is you can't just take something that is either degraded or different or needs some or can use some form of enhancement and get credit for preservation only, and then later get credit for then coming back and enhancing it. You're correct in saying that you would get enhancement credit for it, but depending on the time frame of when you want to do that, you may end up having a longer time lag. So I'm not sure what a previous example would have been, but say they said, okay, well, we gave preservation credit now, 10 years later you're going to do your enhancement. Well, instead of doing preservation credit and then enhancement credit, you're just going to get enhancement credit, but you're going to have a 10-year time lag potentially then, which may very well affect it a lot more than the way it was done previously. So that's something to consider.
That is true. So anyway, I know this one is going to be a change here as well, but DEP, other water management districts have been applying the one step, if you will, successfully for a number of years. We just think about what the project actually is. Pre-apps are certainly encouraged, especially when you're talking about big assessment areas, because that really, really matters, you know, the bigger your assessment area. And I agree with you. One mitigation bank, I think we had like a 5,000 acre assessment area. One point of lift was huge. But so anyway, just take your time, think about what my project actually is, and then go through the motions there and work through UMAM. But deal with the department. It does start to get a little fuzzy when you start having, say 10% or 15% Brazilian pepper in there, and at what point is it enhancement? At what point is it just preservation? So I encourage you to talk, with the process reviewer and everything else to see how it is they're going to be looking at that, and different ways you can look at that. So, but anyway, it's been done successfully, I promise you, throughout the state. So. Anyway, but this is another big change. Well, leads us to with and without preservation assessment. So, we're going to go through preservation assessments here in the next coming slides, which will include PAF and all kinds of other cool stuff. But essentially, without preservation, consider the extent and likelihood of what things would occur. You're preventing threats to it, and you're looking at the reasonably anticipated outcome. That's what the definition says in 62345.200. So you're looking at reasonably anticipated outcome, the extent and likelihood that would occur. Considering easements, restrictive covenants, local, state, federal rules, ordinances, or regulations. So you're going to include it all when you look at this. With preservation, consider the potential to perform the current functions in the long term, considering the protection mechanism proposed. So the protection mechanism proposed and what that protection mechanism says is also important in this consideration. All right. So again, this is just giving back to the reasonable likelihood, the reasonable expectations, reasonably anticipated outcome that you're going to be looking at. All right? And I would focus on functions and maybe not the details of potential land use and activities. Okay? So you have to kind of look and think about what's going to be there. So what resources should be used to determine the potential mitigation assessment area to be developed without preservation? Again, you're going to look at all these things. And however, the highest and best use, should I consider, I think it's one of the questions that we have further on, Mark, we'll get to, should I consider worst case scenario? You can certainly consider all these things, and you have to consider all these things. But also, one of the things to look at here, too, are your local adopted land use maps. Okay, if activity X, whatever that may be, is not in those, well, then you really can't consider activity X. So we're saying these are appropriate stuff to look at. But should you look at the most harmful allowable activity? Well, no. Unless it's reasonably anticipated outcome, then yes. So event and likelihood, yes. Oh, she's way in the back.
One of the arguments you'll often hear is that, well, land use can be changed. So I just want you to clarify that what you're saying is what the existing land use maps for that county or whatever say.
Yes, it's one of the things to consider. I'm not saying it's the only thing to consider, but it's certainly one of the things that you have to look at. I mean, the problem with all of this is if you got a crystal ball. I mean, you're looking into the future. You're looking at what threats would occur to this thing. And essentially exempt threats, so you have to look at that as well. So, but yes, it's one of the things to consider. It's not the only thing. So future land use maps, same thing. It's something to consider. But, this second bullet here, when assessing upland areas that are likely to be part of a single-family lot but not developed with roads, houses, is appropriate to assign a value to those portions of the lot that are not developed. In other words, how far do you go into this analysis? And you can really get pretty deep into this analysis if you let yourself go there. I mean, you could drive yourself nuts getting into all sorts of mapping, assessment areas, speculations, models, and everything else, if you let it. But keep in mind that it's a crystal ball. You're looking at reasonably anticipated outcomes, and that's not an easy thing to do in itself. But certainly, you can take it to an art form that will throw your process review and slow it down a lot. So yes. Oh.
I think that this is probably, to me, one of the hardest things is that when you're looking at surrounding land uses and when you're looking at, historical aerials and trying to figure out what's going on and what's been going on in this area, if you have a site that's undeveloped, still forested and in good shape, but all around you have pasture, you have big ranchettes, and you have all this going on, to me, the assumption is that this could become a ranchette if you didn't preserve it. And that isn't typically how we're doing it. And so that's what confuses me a little bit about this, is that you look at that, but then you say, well, it's not likely that it's a ranchette, or it gets real confusing to me. So I guess some explanation of how you figure this out, or how you would go through that if you looked at the, it's ag zoning and the potential is there, but you don't actually say that it could go to that. It could go to a 0 or whatever that could be.
Well, when you say ranchette, are you talking about, I assume that we have a wetland.
We have a wetland, or we have uplands and wetlands that they're proposing to preserve, more on the preservation side of this.
Okay, so both uplands and wetlands.
Mm-hmm. And more, the wetlands, I think we've got that pretty set. It's more of the uplands of when you would assume that those areas are likely to go to pasture or become part of a home, a barn, or something like that, just like it is around it. And that's, I guess, more so when I'd like to hear your kind of how you'd work that out if you looked around and that's what you saw.
Well, I think I would have to look at everything. I'm thinking back to a project, in a county that we had before. And I was the UMAM mitigation policy, administrator at the time. And oddly enough, it was a mining project that was going along with that. But the uplands, were a critical issue. And I think it was one unit for every 10 acres, I believe it was, type of thing, so you're dealing with that sort of thing. And, they said, well, we can take all these uplands to zero and, we can blitz them all, bulldoze them all down, pour concrete, asphalt, wherever that would be. Or your typical Cape Coral lot, back in the old days where they were all 57 stone because they didn't want to paint it green because they didn't want to mow the grass. But, that type of thing that they were describing. I said, well, I used to work in that county, I used to live in that county, and I know the local county ordinance rules because I used to do enforcement on the DEP side, and we always interacted very well with the code enforcement side. And I know that they have codes against, certain lot clearing. It's only this percentage of lot, and they also have this code, which has that. And after us and their attorney, looked at it and considered all those things, the whole lot couldn't be taken, only a certain percentage of that. So, we talked about it, and what would that mean to the adjacent wetlands, essentially, is what you're looking at for those uplands. And we settled on a score, that afternoon. I think it was within a half an hour or so. So, that's why you have to consider all these things. At first they said, well, this will happen. But when we looked at the big picture of what the extent and likelihood, it wasn't too bad. I can tell you on pine plantations, for example, some work, we did with St. Joe, it was, pine plantations didn't seem to be that bad, really, to the adjacent wetlands. So anyway, it was interesting. I don't know if that helped or not, describing that, but I didn't give you a score or anything. But that's what you got to, we didn't go into percentage of lots. We didn't go into any of that.
So you didn't come up with two separate assessment areas for each lot. You didn't have an assessment area that would go to zero and an assessment area that would not go to zero.
Well, my assessment area were the uplands in that particular case.
Yes,
and they were homogeneous in nature.
But you didn't have a percentage of the lot that did go to zero, and the uplands on the lot, some of those you did have go to zero, some portion of that lot you did go to zero, and
No, I did not make separate assessment areas for that. I called it all one assessment area.
Even though you had the likelihood of harm, in some cases could have been the home, or it could have just been the percentage that your county said needed to remain undisturbed.
I put it all in one, but it depends on whether you're a lumper or splitter, whether you split or not. In other words, if I make a bunch of assessment areas, at the end of the day, I should come out with the same answer if I'm using the same logic. Because this one may go to a lower score than this one, and vice versa as you go down the line. And then you come up with this score. Or I can call the whole thing an assessment area. And so, well, on average, I think it goes down to this score.
Okay.
But, do I come up with the same answer, at the end? A lot of times you have to, you watch your lumping and splitting there.
Okay.
But theoretically, UMAM, whether you're a lumper or a splitter, you should come close,
Okay.
at the end.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh.
Oh, no, now I got.
Oh.
Water management. Wait a minute, wasn't it?
It was all part of my.
And now this is you again somehow related to.
Actually, a chair inside of a kiddie pool somewhere. I'll sit in there next time. No, I have to bring this up because what you said earlier about the land use and zoning. Well, first off, land use is a lot different than zoning.
Yeah.
But what happens in UMAM, which is really agitating to a person like me who knows a lot about zoning versus land use, I can tell you it costs me a lot more money in attorney's fees to get a land use change versus a rezoning. But aside from that, it's just a much bigger process with land use. But it's used interchangeably on here, and if you don't have the land use for a certain type of use, then zoning is immaterial. All right, so, but for you, recently, you just said in the beginning of this section, you said that it was only a consideration what the land use or zoning was. It was only just one of the multiple considerations. Well, let me make sure that if you read the bottom of this slide up here, where it talks about that if you could do, I'm sorry, maybe it's not this one. The one that had yeah, there you go. That if the land use map does not allow for activity X, then the without preservation scenario cannot include activity X. I mean, you really have to delve down into land use to understand what that means, because at face value, anybody who doesn't know that will just say, okay, well, that's no big deal because that's only one of the considerations. But the reality is your land use is very restricting when it comes to this. So a land use of agriculture, per se, or residential or rural residential, it doesn't allow many things. In fact, most of the things that it allows, a lot of the folks that are on the reviewing side, the regulatory side of the UMAM argument, are going to say, well, that's not going to bring you to a zero. That's just going to diminish it somewhat. And so you can't just say that's just one of the considerations, because in all likelihood, and in most of the experience I've had with this, it's everything or nothing in a lot of cases. Okay. And so you have to make sure that you understand, I'm sure you do, but I mean, people read this and what have you, it has a lot of gravity, that one particular requirement right here about the current zoning. And I don't know if this is part of the rule, part of the statute. Where does this last point stand about the current zoning?
That's part of the rule.
Okay, but where does that last statement come from? Is that policy? Is that what? On this one about not currently zoned for activity X. Is that a policy issue? That's not in the rule, right?
No, that is getting at essentially, go back to the example of the one, unit for every 10 acres type of thing. It's getting back to essentially that to say to folks that you can't come in and say it's going to be a wastewater treatment plant, or something like that, or something totally off from what you can contemplate being there.
I understand your point, but let me ask for some advice or some thought from some of the folks that work for the district, that I know have been doing this for a very long time, people that have been here for let's just say more than 15 years working in this community, Northeast Florida. And the Davis family owns a lot of land here in Northeast Florida. And I can promise you that 15 years ago, or 20 or 25 years ago, there were people, if you asked them, what do you think is going to happen with that property down south of 210 in the vicinity of the Intracoastal Waterway, they'd tell you, oh, that's the Davis property. They're richer than whatever. That's just their hunting land. It's going to be like that forever. I mean, that is Nocatee today. What's touted to be what's going to be the next best community in Northeast Florida. One day, I don't know how many 10 or 20,000 residents or whatever it is are going to be there. I mean, it's that. How do you, as an agency, a state agency, try to tell everybody else what the crystal ball is going to be? How are you making that decision is what I want to know. And what is the horizon that you're using? Is there a time horizon that is part of the rule, or?
No, there's no time horizon that's part of the rule.
Because when I put a conservation on something, easement on something, it's forever. And so eventually, I mean, I think the reality in Florida is that eventually it's going to be, if we don't have, I mean, I hate saying this, nuclear Armageddon, I mean, everything in Florida is either going to be preserved or it's going to be developed. So I don't really know how it's, I mean, granted, I agree, the idea of, okay, I'm saying my 10,000 acres is going to be a landfill one day. Well, okay, maybe that's a little far-fetched. Is there going to be a 10,000 acre landfill? No. Could there potentially be a landfill there? Yes, on a portion of the property, some reasonable mix of things. But that's really hard to deal with.
It is very hard. I mean, no doubt about it. It's always been hard. Before UMAM, it's always been hard. Because if you take a look at what's in UMAM, it's exact the same thing that's in the ERP Applicant's Handbook of Basis Review. I mean, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed since 1995. We've always had these what-if arguments. Extent and likelihood and anticipated outcome. We've always had this. It's nothing new for UMAM at all.
I understand that, but I think what is happening is that the state side, your position about this, in my view, is you're taking a hard line approach that is leaving zero room for negotiation or arguing about what may or may not happen. Because if I take your stance there, there's nothing. I mean, not nothing, but it's nothing in terms of development pressure or any sort of future for that property. And if you look at an existing land use map, there's a lot of property that is currently has land use of rural residential or agriculture that I even as slow as things are right now, I think in 10, 15 years, there's tons of land that's going to be developed, high intensity development. So how do you manage that? Because right now you guys are drawing a very stark line in the sand and saying, that's it. Beyond this, it's only what's allowable, and I'm telling you, that's not much.
Where is this? I mean, what we're saying is that you have to look at, you have to look at this. Considering any existing easements, restrictive covenants, local, state, federal rules, ordinances, and regulations. Yes?
Part of the local rules and ordinances allows for, part of the process allows for land use and zoning changes, which I would think it'd be smarter to look at patterns of development rather than existing land use and zoning, because we've all worked on hundreds of projects where that's changed on a regular basis. So it'd be smarter. I mean, there's a disincentive for people to preserve environmentally sensitive land on the outskirts of town. Land is cheap, and that could be done out there. But since you're saying today it's not zoned for development, we're not going to give you the full preservation credit. Versus if, like Mike's saying, you're looking 10 or 15 years out, it probably development will reach there. At that point, the land values are so high, it's probably not going to turn into a mitigation bank or a big preservation area.
Yeah, but I can also say that, when development does come there and price of the land, they want to, modify the conservation easement to move it out to the outskirts of land. I mean,
well, that's been changed.
Yeah, I mean, we can just keep going and going and going, and I think you can also make the argument that, really of anywhere, is it going to be preserved or developed?
I think the lack of looking at patterns of development, you're just looking at it from a point in time today, saying this is the existing land use and zoning subdivision right next door, it's going to get rezoned. I just think it's short-sighted not to look ahead at reasonable development that's going to go on.
Well, I think you have to look at reasonably anticipated outcomes. I mean, that's what the rule is saying.
But it didn't allow for that when you're looking at existing land use, ordinances and regulations.
Yeah,
when everyone in the business knows that it's going to get developed 5 years from now.
I think the concept there is to say, like what, I don't know your name, but Is it
Mike.
Mike? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you had a point, Mike, where you understood what that bullet, I think, was originally getting at. In other words, the landfill example that you brought up. Okay, I'm not going to have it's not reasonable that I'm going to have a landfill, here in this particular thing, whatever. That's really what it was getting at, is to say, think about that. And if it's not in the local rules, ordinances, zoning, land use.
But that bullet point said that if the land use doesn't allow for X, then it can't be considered. Well, rural silviculture land use would say that you could get zoning for 1 unit and 10 acres. So that's all you're going to consider as the use of that property. Or let's say cattle pasture, or maybe continued silviculture use, or or borrow pits maybe, and that's it. You're not going to consider, because that's my land use. And there are properties that are locked in the development, right now in the development window now that don't have land use, that people are going right now before the county commissions. And I'm telling you, the local counties, they don't have the money to put their staff to work on a rezoning. People are going and getting land use amendments right now, today, before county commissions, and they're making the staff spend money on a red herring, all so that they can get better mitigation credit from their property. I mean, that's just I think that's inappropriate. It's irresponsible that there's a system that requires that. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, because it makes sense. But there needs to be some sort of I think that last bullet point you said, of saying that one bullet point, that if it's not allowed within that, then it can't be considered. That's hard to manage.
Put it on that next slide, to add that statement.
There.
Notice that it says adopted local land use maps, not existing land use maps. So if there's an adopted future land use map, that could be considered as well. And you would expect, if it's a future land use map that's been adopted, that area that we're describing should be in the future land use map condition, something that would then be allowable. You understand where I'm going?
Well, the future land use map is what identifies the current land use allowance. So but those are modified every day. I mean, every month at county commission meetings. So you're going to tell me I have to go modify my land use so that I can get better mitigation credit. I'm telling you that you put that staff to work there, just like you don't want folks coming into your office putting your staff to work, spending money, taxpayer dollars, on something that they know is not true. If I go get an ERP permit and I give you $4,500, and your staff spends hundreds and hundreds of hours working on that permit, and the reality was, I'm just trying to sell it to the state, and I have no intention of developing this because there's no one that would pay me the money to buy this property for that use. I think that's inappropriate. I don't think encouraging us to do that is very good policy.
Well, it's a crystal ball thing. I mean, in dealing with all this, it's the future is hard to predict. I mean, it just is.
You can look at past experience.
Sure.
Since '86, I can see what happens.
Well, you can't to some extent, but it's the future.
Right. I mean, the Thousand Friends of Florida has projected maps of development. You can look at
sure, everybody
what
does.
You've done since '86.
Sure, everybody does. But
it's not that crystal ball.
I think it is. I mean, I think there's a lot of variables in there that you have to consider, and that's what we're saying is you can consider these things. It's reasonably anticipated outcome, but you have to consider all these things that are in the rule.
Right. I think looking at
I'll just
say patterns of development that you can see has happened or likely happen is a fairer approach than what's existing zoning and land use, because it does get changed every month.
Sure. But it's a difficult thing. I mean, it certainly is when you're talking about the crystal ball. But you also have to remember, going back to the old ratios, when preservation first started out, go back to the old Twachtman memo, Secretary Twachtman of DER back in the day, it was 100 to 1. And then it got down to 10 to 1 to 60 to 1. And so preservation was always meant to be a really high ratio, as compared to the other forms of mitigation. So just keep that in mind too, as we go throughout the day. But all right, we have been doing this for about an hour. You want to take a 10-minute break? Is that in there? What did you plan on, Mark?
Yeah, we could take a quick break.
15?
No, just
10, okay. All right. 10, thank you.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started back up again, so if everybody can go ahead and... Can you hear me? Whistle?
But I'm not going to.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. Back up again, please. Yeah. All right. Okay, let's go back all the way to slide number 12. Slide 12. Okay, real quick, before we go any further, there was one request asked about since this presentation is basically is based on the UMAM top 10 issues, that if you received the invite for it, you have those top 10 issues. The slides do address them, but they're not in the 1 through 10 order. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back right now to the slides that start addressing which of the top 10, and I'll tell you up to the point where we are now, before we go any further, what top 10 issues have been addressed based on these slides. And then you can basically go from there. Hopefully that will help kind of understand where things are. Right now, the slide that we have up here on slide number 12, it addressed top 10 issue number 9. So if you want to just write these down for now, and then when you get the slide itself from the website, then you can go back through and take a look and see how they correlate. Slide number 13 addressed top 10 issue 4A.
Which one was that?
The next slide.
Oh, all right.
We're just going to go in order. Next slide. That addresses top 10 issue 4A. Slide number 14 is just a generic one, kind of setting things up. It does not address specifically a top 10 issue. Slide number 15 is the same. Slide 16 addresses top 10 issue number 1. It starts to. That's part of that. Slide number 17 addresses top 10 issue number 1. Slide 18 addresses top 10 issue number 1 as well. Goes into it. Slide 19 also is on top 10 issue 1. Slide 20 is top 10 issue number 2 and 3. Starts that. There's going to be a number of these slides. Slide 20, slide 21, slide 22, slide 23, and actually we're going to get now to slide 24, which also starts, still also addresses top 10 issue 2 and 3. So I think we're now back to where we were to this point. We actually got one too far. All right, so we're now starting on slide number 23, which we are still on addressing top 10 issue number 2 and 3. When we go to each slide, I will tell you what top 10 issue it addresses as we get to that slide.
Okay. This chart here is just some things to consider when you're looking at these activities. Now, these activities, I've always looked at them as the big picture activities is what I'm looking at. You can get pretty in the weeds, as we have been talking about, to get there and look at these projected future impacts that will happen and the threats to the systems. But these are some things to look at. Here are some other things to consider. Timbering, silviculture activities. And we've already talked about the cyclical nature of these things, whether they're clear-cut, whether they're tiger-striped, that sort of thing. Use a reasonable scientific judgment to get there. Exempt docks, exempt mangrove trimming, and I think we already hit on uplands zoned to allow for low-density residential development. And really, you have to kind of look at the big picture, say what, based on these few things that I'm going to consider, what will be my score? So we usually don't get too much into the weeds here, even although it's really, really easy to do so. Does anybody have any questions about that?
And real quick, this does address top 10 issue 4B.
Can you answer the last bullet point?
When would the Upland score be scored a 0 for without preservation? So and I guess that's getting to location and landscape support or community structure. All right, so in 2007, we did clarify that location and landscape support goes to 0 when community structure support score goes to 0, right? Does everybody know where that one is? Okay. I always look at this thing as a continuum. When we get to location and landscape support, maybe this will become more clear, but it has always been our contention, DEP's contention, that location and landscape support can change. And I'm not really familiar. What's the issue there? Here.
Well, I guess if I understood the full outline where we're going, maybe I can leave this alone for right now, and if we're going to get into detail about that, great. So we can get this.
Yeah, we are going to get into location and landscape support, if that's what you're...
Okay.
And this could be talked about there in the context of uplands.
Okay.
But by rule, you know, if your community structure goes to 0, then your location and landscape support also go to 0. I mean, that was a little tweak, you know, that was made in 2007. So we are going to get there, but it can, and it can go down. Oh, look at there, we're there. So we have 3 functional assessment categories: location, landscape support, water environment, and community structure. Community structure is also broken down into the vegetated and structural habitat and benthos assessments. By far, location landscape support is the one that generates the most questions and is the hardest to do and get your head around. So by far, that's the one that causes most people the most problems, myself included. So it's, you know, the water environment community structure score are a little easier, especially after you establish your part 1, you know what your baseline is, and you know where you're going, you know what your impact is, or what your mitigation, enhancement, or restoration is. So let's get into that. So,
Here, real quick, just to clarify, these next few slides are going to be more generic discussions on location and landscape. They don't specifically address a top 10 issue individually.
but we need to remind me to make sure we
Yep.
talk about that one. Okay. So I always remind folks that it's location and landscape support. All right, there's 2 things in there. And you read the preamble to this section, location and landscape support section. The first 2 sentences kind of tell you where you are on that. The value of functions provided by an assessment area to fish and wildlife are influenced by the landscape position of the assessment area and its relationship with surrounding areas. While the geographic location of the assessment area does not change, the ecological relationship between the assessment area and the surrounding landscape may vary from the current condition to the with impact and with mitigation conditions. Okay? So the bottom line is that it can change. Due to the ecological relationship aspect of this category, it can change. So you can't move it, but you can make it better, the ecological relationship better. All right? But first, and this has to do with not only location landscape support, but water environment and community structure too. If you read, and what I call characterizations are the, you know, a score of 10, and then you usually have a list, score of 7, score of 4, that sort of thing. If you read right before each of those sections, you're going to see basically a sentence that generally describes what that characterization is about, and you also see a sentence that states the score is based on 1, reasonable scientific judgment, and 2, characterized by a predominance of the following as applicable. So, number 1, first and foremost, is reasonable scientific judgment. Okay? So you have to keep that in mind. So which one comes first? Reasonable scientific judgment. Do you have to use all the characterizations? No. Does that mean you have a low score if you don't use them all? No. Can you consider things not listed? Yes, you can, as long as it's reasonable scientific judgment. So you have to look at that. So if you look at, probably doesn't affect you guys too much, coral and hard bottom and seagrass and that sort of thing. I don't know if it does or not. Okay, a little bit. The contention there to our Bureau of Beaches and Coastal System, I always said is, look, you've got reasonable scientific judgment. Even though UMAM does not guide you through evaluating a seagrass bed as well as it does a terrestrial system, you can still use it. So you can still use it. You can still look at the characterizations that are applicable, and plus you say, well, these things make up a good seagrass bed community structure-wise, and in this region, this is what it is. Clarify your part 1, and then look and score it. So reasonable scientific judgment is a really, really big thing, but a lot of people forget about that sucker, and it's in before every one of the characterizations that we have. All right, so anyway. Factors to consider when assessing location landscape support. Availability, connectivity, and quality. You're looking at opportunity here. Remember, we're talking about ecological relationship. So we have a list of characterizations in the rule of what you're going to be looking at. But you're looking at opportunity, availability, connectivity, and what you do to that wetland to make it better for the species listed in Part 1. Remember, your fish and wildlife species. Can they get to the area? Can they use the area based on what you've done to it? Did you improve its ecological relationship? Sometimes you can make a wetland a whole lot better, but if things can't get to it, or it doesn't provide an opportunity for things to use it, then you can't go up on this score. Does that make sense? You're looking at that ecological relationship, so you can either improve it or not. If you read the categories and the characterizations as we go through them, you're going to see that it's going to ask you a lot about habitats outside, opportunities outside, connectivity, detrital export. It's going to ask you a lot about the outside. And all these things are getting to the ecological relationship that it has, that its assessment area has, to what is around it. So it's a little bit different when you're talking about a bank or a subdivision, but essentially that's what you're looking at right there. And reasonable scientific judgment, don't forget that. Support the wildlife by outside habitats. Habitats outside it represent the full range. So that's a 10. And we also always go back to the life history requirements of all the wildlife listed in Part 1. That's why I said Part 1 is very, very important, that you tell somebody that's my baseline. This is what I'm looking at and basing my scores on. So, and I forgot to mention before, if I could change the forms, I would myself make 4 forms. I would make the first form to say, what is it supposed to be? What should it be? That's my optimal native community type, and I would describe that thing for folks. My second form would be, what is it now? What is this thing right now? Third form would be, what will it be? After I get through putting dirt on it, digging it up, making it better, whatever it is. Then my fourth form would be the scores. So I have my base, what I'm basing these scores on, my baseline, and then I'm going, this is what it is now, this is what it's going to be, and then each of those forms go back to the set of scores that you have, what's currently in your Part 2 form. So the UMAM rule is kind of set up that way, but the forms aren't set up that way. So what should it be, what is it now, what will it be, and then your scores. So I don't know if that helps everybody or not, but that's what I do in my mind. So if you have something that's, separate from UMAM and you want to, somehow paint that picture, that's essentially the picture that you're trying to paint for folks. And based on your optimal native community type description, you're saying that these things exist. And after I get done with it, here's where my ecological relationship has improved, if you're trying to get a lift from there. All right, invasive exotics or other invasive plants in the proximity. This is pretty self-explanatory, what's around it. Wildlife access to and from, depends on the critter. So look at those movements. So isolated wetlands, you'll see this a few times in there. Just because one of these things are not applicable doesn't mean it gets a lower score. Sometimes it happens. Not saying everybody here, thinks that way, but just want to make sure that people understand if you have an isolated wetland, it's doing what it does. It's no better or no worse than a connected wetland. So anyway, I don't think anybody here will look at it that way. So impacts to land uses. Land uses again, Mike. Outside assessment area to fish and wildlife. So look at what's going on around it. Again, landscape position and support. Think of your ecological relationship. Downstream, is this thing affecting things downstream, hydrologically connected or not? If it's not, is it supposed to be? Because again, optimal native community type, that's where you really want to nail down what this thing is supposed to be doing and what you're comparing it off of. All right, downstream discharges. Habitats are affected by discharges from assessment areas. So if it's solely or critically depending on discharges from your assessment area, good thing. So keep track of these things. Protection of wetland functions by upland mitigation assessment. Now remember, it assesses the level of protection of the wetland functions by the upland mitigation areas. So uplands, the benefits, or what you're scoring, is really how those uplands benefit the associated wetland, or the adjacent wetland. So does everybody understand that? I mean, that's what you're really scoring for an upland. You're not scoring it based on how well it compares to the optimal native community type, only in the way that it serves to contribute to the adjacent wetland. Because you're looking at the functions that it's providing, and that's what you're scoring it on.
Beyond 25 feet?
But to what it does, to whatever your assessment area is. So that's what you're scoring. But I mean, when we were looking at pine plantations over a large amount of area, I would say in St. Joe, in our most bunged up wet prairies, that have been planted there, our location landscape support was somewhere around a 7, I'm going to say, and most of those that we were looking at. Because the functions that those uplands were providing to those wetlands, a large amount of those functions were still intact, I guess. And they weren't, they were affected, certainly, but a lot of them were still intact. Had both U.S. Fish and Wildlife out there and FWC, and we went through the whole litany of things that could nest and den and what things could not, in that particular environment. And there were really salamanders were the only thing that they said would not, but you would certainly have a lower abundance. The abundance would not be there, with your wildlife there. So that was their contention. But the water quality, we were in and around West Bay, but the water quality coming off the things, the water quantity were still decent, pretty good, if they followed the BMPs and did everything right. So,
Is there a distance from a wetland a physical distance, that beyond which you no longer get credit for upland support of a wetland?
Depends on the function you're looking at.
I'm doing a 7,000 acre mitigation bank. It's a mosaic of isolated wet weather wetlands, and on the low downstream side, it's changing from a wet weather pond and wet prairie to an emergent marsh.
Okay?
So do the uplands that are a long way away from the emergent marsh, how far away? Is there a distance requirement so that if it's beyond X number of feet, then you're not going to give credit for it?
If I'm looking, it depends on, well, most of your wildlife species, well, depends on what wildlife species you're going to be looking at. The things that you put in your part one, all right, let's go back to that list. You're going to be looking at, can those things get there, right? After they get there, can they utilize, or are they there to begin with, and can they get there to utilize the thing that you're doing, that you're making it better? So the distance you go out on your wildlife there depends on the wildlife that you have listed there. If you're looking at from a water quality, quantity type of thing, in other words, what does that sandhill do for my adjacent marsh? You may not have to go out that far. You might have to go to wherever the sandhill is. That's what it feeds it. So it depends on the function that you're looking at and considering the importance of the upland to that adjacent wetland. I would say that the more wetland-upland interface you have, such as some parts in North Florida where you have a high degree of that, and you have a mosaic of uplands and wetlands going on there, high degree of interface. And so certainly the argument there, at least in one mitigation bank that we had in the Panhandle, it had a lot of that. So we looked at them, really all of those uplands to be associated with the adjacent wetlands. We gave credit for it.
Is your interest wildlife, or should it be aquatic and wetland dependent wildlife?
Wetland dependent, aquatic and wetland dependent. And pay attention to counties too. Sometimes they are and they aren't. But in the basis review and applicant's handbook, they have a list there. So that was a good question. So I guess to answer the other question, Mike, that was earlier, when do you consider community structure to be a zero? And going through there is when all the functions are taken away. So, if adjacent to the site, is going to be an industrial impervious use, and it's all going to go away. In other words, all the functions that those uplands provide to my adjacent wetland go away, then, it becomes a zero. But there's a continuum between, from industrialized, highly impervious, filling it all up and taking away all those functions to, 1 acre or 1 unit every 20 acres or something like that, or pine plantation use or whatever that would be. So there's a continuum in there to me that you have to look at. But you have to look at the specific functions, and those functions are a little bit different because the uplands, provide optimal protection of the wetland functions. So that's what you're looking at here. I don't know. It's a continuum, and you have to think about it. But to me, in UMAM, what I wanted, when I was there, and looking at this rule, and I'm still involved, but I would like more characterizations on the upland mitigation assessment. What exactly are you looking at, and have them kind of listed out, things to consider, just like we do for these other ones. So, because right now it kind of says optimal protection of wetland functions, and it doesn't specifically name them, but that's what you're looking at. But I think more guidance on this would be a good thing.
I think our concern, there were some in the past that took that language that said if community structure goes to zero, then location landscape support goes to zero. They took that, if it doesn't go to zero, then there is no lift, there is no zero in location landscape support. You get no lift in location landscape support.
I gotcha. Okay. No, it can go down. You're saying that if I have all 10s and then my other categories go to 1, does the location landscape support still say a 10, stay a 10? Is that what you're?
Well, we had situations where you have the one unit per 10 acres or 20 acres. They took the position that there was no lift in location landscape support unless there was the impervious component of the lots.
Oh,
And
it can
so
move.
there's a continuum.
Right, it can move. It can change.
So it's not a requirement that if it goes to zero, community structure goes to zero, location landscape support goes to zero. That's an absolute, but it doesn't mean that if community structure doesn't go to zero, there is no lift in location landscape support.
Correct. I mean, it can change. Yeah, if that's the concern, it can change. It absolutely changes if it reaches a zero. So there was some confusion in that apparently.
For upland, going back to the 25-foot upland buffer real quick,
Okay.
the goal originally was to have treatment of stormwater runoff. A lot of that can be accomplished from ground cover vegetation. So I know in some projects, some of the older ones, they wanted ground cover left, but people could cut the trees out, cut bushes out, open up the view, versus if you preserved it intact, you provide more, vegetative community structure lift. Just throwing that out for whatever it's worth.
Okay, thanks. Are we on to the next one? All right, not all the attributes are applicable to all the assessment areas. We know that. Some may be more relevant than the others. And location landscapes, of course, for on-site mitigation assessment areas typically stay the same or decrease with the current and mitigation score. And again, we're just kind of saying with the memo is getting back to that all these things should be considered and really that it can change, because we're talking about the ecological relationship here. I do want to stress that really look at it as both things, and whenever you think about that category, think about it in those terms. It's really those two things. So, because otherwise if you think about it only in locational type of aspect, it's very hard to make that sucker change. But it's DEP's contention that it does, and it can. Okay, preservation adjustment factor.
Real quick, just to clarify, this is now starting to address top 10 issue number 5. All of the PAF slides from here on address number 5.
All right, our June 15th, 2011 memo. Want you to keep track of these scores and considerations. Make sure your logic trail is there so everybody can see it. Same logic trails we're asking you to do on optimal native community type. What is it now? What will it be? Type of thing. You're trying to set up your logic, your basis of these things, and that's what it's trying to do here. So the 5 considerations in PAF. Oh, it's in .503A. All right, 5 factors. Number 1, the extent to which proposed management activities within the preserve area promote natural ecological conditions such as fire patterns or the exclusion of invasive exotic species. So if it's self-sustaining and doesn't need a lot of active management, how much significance would this be given to the management consideration? Not much likely. I mean, if all you need to do is fence it and it's self-sustaining, you don't need to burn it and that sort of thing. Not much consideration. However, if you're dealing with a habitat that is really dependent upon prescribed fire, then that management plan with a burn aspect is critical to that. So you have to look at what the assessment area is, what habitat it is, and how much of active management does it need or not. Now, as I said before you even get here, in order to look at the appropriateness aspect, to know if the adversely affected functions are offset, to know if you have reasonable assurance to get to this fact, or to get this far, you have to have settled on this to begin with before you even got here, right? So this, when you get to UMAM and you get to scoring it, nothing should be a surprise here. That's what I'm saying. So you have to have the reasonable assurance, and all these things should have been in place before. So pre-apps, this is where pre-apps, are certainly critical. You mentioned it before. What is the difference between preservation and enhancement and everything else? And that's what you're going to figure this out. So when you turn in your mitigation proposal, remember that big fat list in the basis of review and applicant's handbook? So it's all in there, and that's where all these conversations should happen. All these conversations should happen before you get to UMAM. Is the big, huge point. So don't go to UMAM without this. Ecological and hydrological relationships between wetlands, other surface waters, and uplands. So going back, Mike, to the degree of interface, that we have there. So what is the degree to which the uplands provide hydrological or ecological support to the surface water? So take a look at this thing. The relationship is crucial. Scarcity of the habitat and the degree which list species use the area. So please take a look at those.
Question.
Yes.
How large of an area do you look at scarcity of habitat? Drainage basin, East Central Florida, the entire state?
Not the entire state. See, there was a bright line. I give you one. Not the entire state. That's a good question. How far do you look out? And this goes back to the uniqueness issue, really. I mean, in ERP. I mean, doesn't it? When you look at the factors and the functions that are going to be adversely affected, when you get to that point, the ecological value, and 12.223, when you look at condition, hydrologic connection, uniqueness, location, fish and wildlife utilization. I mean, when you get back to that aspect, again, that's why I say a lot of these questions that you're asking are applicant's handbook questions. And how far do you go out? And what do you consider to be scarce? Or what do you consider to be unique? Depends on the regional landscape and depends on, in other words, cypress domes in themselves are not a unique thing in the state of Florida. We have quite a few, but is this a unique thing in that particular landscape? Are there any more around this, or is this the only one? Well, possibly it could be unique. Does that mean that it can't be impacted and it can't be offset by mitigation? Doesn't mean that, but you're going to have to take a look at that very carefully and the scarcity that goes along with that. So it's an ERP question. And in fact, I was just having this conversation a little while ago that, UMAM typically brings to light issues that are already present in the ERP rules, in the basis review and applicant's handbook. Usually people, when they get to that portion of UMAM, they have difficulty in it, so they think it's a UMAM issue and it needs to be clarified. But the point is, it's an applicant's handbook thing, and you didn't solve it before you got here, which means you might have an issue with your reasonable assurance or your what functions were offset or anything else. So I know I keep harping on that, but it's really, really true. And if you guys focus on that, when you review an application and start looking at these things, if you've done everything up here and gone through all these issues and worked them out with your applicant, or if your consultant worked it out with the agency, when you get to UMAM, you're filling in the blanks and getting it there. So, but these have always been here. Always. UMAM is just maybe shining a little light on them and things like that, but they've always been here. Nothing has changed.
Problem that you run in with the agency when you're looking at a unique habitat is that I can go to FWC's filling in the gaps or something like that and show them on a piece of paper that they consider it's a unique habitat.
Mm-hmm.
Yet when I go to the agency and talk to them, it's not a unique habitat. And it's all based on the land size, drainage basin size, something has got to be, you've got to come to an agreement somewhere. And you can tell me that I haven't done the steps in beforehand before I got to the UMAM. That's not the issue. The issue is what I consider regional and what they consider regional. And it's an issue that, I mean, if I document it, I can finally shove it down their throat, but it shouldn't have to be that way.
Okay. So it has the definition of regional is what you're after.
I've been doing this for 28 years.
Mm-hmm.
All right? I can go through pre-application conferences. I can talk to the different individual people that are reviewing projects. I can talk to Michelle, or I can go to the Corps, and I'll get two different answers. All right? It shouldn't be difficult. It should be consistent. And because of UMAM, and we're focusing on smaller and smaller issues, everybody's losing the landscape scope of the whole thing. So I think scarcity of habitat and regional significance is something that there should be some guidance on and some direction from DEP to, since they're the supervisory agency, so the other water management districts and everybody can do it the same. Because if we don't get regional right, you're not going to get your restoration or your impacts right at all, period.
Gotcha. Okay. We'll work on that. Mm-hmm. Okay, let me write that down. Agreed, and I think that's where your issue is. Okay, proximity of the area. This goes back to your question, doesn't it? How regional does it have to be? How proximal does it have to be?
Hey, Calvin, can you just go back to the previous slide just real quick? Just want to make sure we address the other bulleted items there. Sure
Oh, okay. All right. Did we leave off on 3? Does the substance area have to be both scarce and used by listed species to get credit for this consideration? Yes. It's an and. Does foraging count, or does the assessment area have to have more than one substantial use, such as rookery, nesting? No. Okay. Proximity of the area. So proximity of the area to be preserved to areas of national, state, or regional ecological significance. So how proximal does an area need to be? So what has been happening here lately? Is there another thing to this? Or no? I don't know if we... What has been happening here now? I mean, this was addressing a concern. Maybe I should start there of how proximal it has to be. I mean, obviously, if you're adjacent to something, butting up to it, everybody agrees that's proximal. Okay, no issues there? Right? So we good? So if we're one property removed, or if we're 40 acres removed, or it's a mile down the road, I-95 runs between them? Okay.
Or a four-lane road.
All right.
Versus an interstate.
Okay.
I've got one right now where the applicant hasn't even submitted an application, but we've had a pre-app right up against some water management property. And there's a proposed 4-lane highway that's going to go through this wetland. DOT hasn't gotten a permit for it yet. And the staff is already saying, well, the portion that's right up against water management property, you get a higher PAF, but we know DOT is going to put the highway in, so the rest of the wetland will have a lower PAF. So in that sense, the applicant's been penalized for a DOT project they haven't even applied for an anticipated use. Separated by a road with, I think, large box culverts, wildlife crossings.
So they looked at that as a reasonably anticipated outcome? Well, the zoning and everything else? I don't know.
Probably will be done.
Okay.
But that's proximal box culverts, but it drops.
Right, and this is getting back to the connectivity issue and the ecological relationship primarily. I mean, essentially, that's what, how do these things interact? You know, is it
How would you keep the
is it
PAF
proximal
from dropping?
amount?
If you're going to be working with both the applicant and DOT, how would you work it where the applicant's not penalized with this lower PAF? How do you make DOT have more, maintain the connectivity?
Right, that's a hard one to do, especially with DOT's process that they have to do.
Haven't submitted yet.
What's the land use of the property, Byron?
Industrial
That's
park.
the answer.
Industrial park. So you're looking at a high threat and a lower PAF. Is that what your initial thoughts are?
Well, this is just another one of these subjective things that you just stumble through project by project. You know, we'll talk about what kind of PAF to give you for the property up against water management land, and we'll get back with you on the balance of it. But that's pretty proximal.
It is proximal. I mean, it's surrounded, well, it's against the road and everything else, but you also have to look at, you know, again, getting back to whether these areas to be preserved include corridors between these. I mean, you're looking at that connectivity aspect here, and I think that's what they're struggling with, is that connectivity aspect. You know, it's right adjacent to it, but if I have a 50-foot cement wall, I mean, it could be adjacent to it, but the corridor aspects, that transfer, the ecological relationship is severed. So it's going back to that issue.
It's not severed if you require DOT to provide passage.
Yes.
Right. Well, I'm working with DOT. It's they certainly have their process that they go through. So may or may not be able to accommodate you, I guess, in that. But yes.
What if it's all part of the same swamp system, and the threat of development to the swamp is obviously minimal, but it's pieces of property that are under conservation easement trying to make regional proximity, when there's there's a connection associated with the wetland itself. There's no threat of development because it's a wetland.
No threat of development because it's a wetland. So
So it's not a big swamp, and there's conservation easements all up and down it, but there's a gap. There's no conservation easements in you mentioned 40 acres, there's one 40-acre block, it doesn't happen. But there's swamp all around it. Is
Okay.
that proximal, even though there's an area to be preserved is not directly connected, but tangent? I'm pretty loud.
Yeah, I think it can. I think it can. I mean, because what you're looking at is the ecological relationship between the two. I mean, you're looking, can these things, do I have connectivity here? Do I have something can be there? Now, regionally significant, or is it regionally significance here or regional ecological value? Which one do you use here? Either one? Okay. I can't remember which one it is in your applicant's handbook. So, I mean, that is something, that's a slippery type of thing, regional significance. So that has been debated for years. So, well, be careful with that one, I guess. When ERP became ERP and the mediation, and if you look at the testimony of Janet Llewellyn, she said regional ecological value. An example of that is Walker's Ranch, for the Disney. And that, to her, had regional ecological value. And that's, kind of one of the only definitions I know, and pointing to something and go, yes, that's it. But, it's when you're talking about regional significance and everything else, just keep that in mind. It's supposed to be something really big and regionally, go back to your question, and it matters to that watershed. So.
Real quick, just want to make sure, I know that sometimes we're jumping ahead real quick, and even though you have a loud voice, just want to make sure we're able to capture any of these questions. So please hold until I can get over to you with the microphone, please.
All right. I think we already addressed this one, didn't it? It was one of your issues, the extent and likelihood. It's covered in the PAF as well. So does anybody have any more questions on that, or no? Yes?
On this one?
Yes.
Actually, I did.
Okay. Oh, you remember to wait. See, I didn't even remember. I was waiting for your question.
In Northeast Florida in particular, Chinese tallow's a big problem. And there are many wetlands I've seen over time where it's been timbered for silviculture, greenbelt, and you come back in and tallow's just all in there. And once it gets in, it's, depending on how much, it can be almost impossible to get rid of it. Is there allowance to provide a higher PAF to preserve intact native wetlands when there's a high degree of threat? If it were timbered, ongoing, tallow's going to get in there and start taking it over?
So your question is?
The extent and likelihood of potential adverse impacts if the assessment area were not preserved. One sometimes unanticipated adverse impact, if you didn't preserve it and the landowner said, I'm just going to keep timbering it periodically, is that tallow will get in there and start to become dominant. So I think if you could demonstrate there are tallow wetlands in the vicinity, this is a nice example of native wetland habitat. Give us a little more lift than just your standard PAF.
So in other words, your wetland is a pretty decent wetland. It is an important ecosystem. So you've gotten past that, because remember we had the, what about highly degraded? So we're not in a highly degraded native system, and we're not in a pine plantation type of scenario. So your question is, what's the potential for harm to that when I consider the event, the reasonably anticipated outcome, that this is a reasonably anticipated outcome based on all the considerations that I considered before in getting here, and do you do that? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, if it's an important ecosystem, then we can consider it for preservation, and whatever the reasonably anticipated outcome would be, which could be one of those. In other words, you could say it can be, these things can happen to this system, and this is what I think reasonably could happen to these things at the end of the day.
Right, it might not be the 1 acre cypress dome in the middle of the subdivision, but if there were a tract of forested wetlands along the edge of the project that's a significant size, 10, 20 acres, that could be carved out and managed for timber.
Mhm.
And if you cut it, you're going to get tallow in there. It's just a matter of time. Seems like you should give some consideration, a little bit of lift on PAF.
Well, I think that is one of the things that you would consider.
Okay.
I
I
mean-
haven't experienced that.
Okay, all
Just
right.
planting the seed.
Planting the seed. Yes. All right.
In looking at that, I would think that I would also, as a reviewer, in order to provide that lift, I would want to look at some kind of management plan that is incorporated into the preservation in order to ensure that this area does not become infested with tallow regardless of whether the area was preserved or not,
Oh, yes, yes,
or regardless of whether the area was timbered or not. I'm
absolutely.
sorry. So I think the two would have to work in conjunction with one another. There would need to be some kind of ongoing management plan in conjunction with the lift provided that Byron's talking about.
Absolutely, yeah, and sorry, I assumed all, because, all that stuff you've gotten before, I assumed all, yeah, all that stuff was there. Yes, good point. You have another one over here, Mark.
Has there been any movement to coordinate the district's current position on preservation adjustment factor with the Corps' position that it's irrelevant?
The PAF is irrelevant, or
Yeah,
preservation
they don't
is
take,
irrelevant?
and I could be wrong on that, but my understanding is the Corps' position is the preservation adjustment factor is just not scientific. Do I have old information?
We use it, but it's kind of implicitly within the location of landscape as well. So we don't assign a value based on the 5 factors, but we take that into account in our conditions.
So the Corps of Engineers' position is that it's in location and landscape, and this is not really considered separately.
Well, there's no policy, like there's no district policy saying we're not going to use the effect, and it depends on the development as well. It's the mitigation environment being evaluated.
Give her mine.
Okay. Okay, I must have read that somewhere, and it must have not been a legitimate source or something.
Just to remind everybody that they want us to use the mics.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's okay. I forget too. If it wasn't hooked to my shirt, then I probably would. But anyway, okay. Interesting.
When do we make the leap from having preservation require management anyways? Because in my opinion, I don't need a PAF of anything when I'm going to have a management plan. When did that happen? And how did we get from that little transition that maybe went unnoticed to here we are now? I've got to have a management plan in place to help me with my PAF score. I think the PAF needs to be a 1 if I have a management plan.
I'm a
It's
little
an enhancement. It's not preservation anymore. It's an enhancement project. I'm going to enhance, whether it needs it today, if you tell me it needs to be managed for the long term, to me, that's enhancement. You can't, being committed to something forever, which is what a management plan does to me, that's enhancement. Why would I have to have a PAF score at all?
Well, I'm a little confused by one of the things you said, which was, when did we make the leap of requiring management plans? Is that the first one?
Well, in order for me to have the higher PAF, one of the considerations is whether it has a management plan, right? And it really comes to light just because of the question, I guess, the counterback with Byron's scenario, and I think it makes sense if the issue is tallow is invading all around it, and assumption is going to come in, have a management plan in place to prepare for that, but
Okay, you're getting back to this one?
yes.
I mean, a management plan has always been required as part of your mitigation proposal and your applicant's handbook.
For preservation?
For mitigation,
For preservation?
yes, for all mitigation.
Okay,
I mean,
if my proposed is preservation,
Now-
I
Now, your management plan will vary. It is as strict as it needs to be.
I can provide just a little bit more clarification on that. A management plan would be required, but that management plan could be literally a half a page, you saying that basically this is in such good shape that my management is going to be to prevent exotics from coming in and in the future clean them out. That's not enhancement because it's not being enhanced right now. It's
I'm
going to
gonna
be
watch it.
maintained.
I'm
in
going
a
to
good
watch
shape.
it, I'm going to put a fence around it, and I'm going to watch it.
That's
I mean,
the difference.
It could be as simple as that to, this is when I'm going to burn it, I'm going to try to burn it on this frequency, this is what I'm going to, I mean, it could be very, very involved.
Are you saying there's always been required a management plan for preservation as mitigation? Is that what you're saying?
Under the mitigation proposal section, K, a management plan comprising all aspects of operation maintenance, including water management practices, vegetation establishment, exotic nuisance species control, fire management, and control of access. I mean, I'm just saying it's always been there as part of the proposals that we kind of need. Now, they're going to vary depending on the ecosystem that we need, of what you need in that management plan. You know, some of the things that Matt gets is I'm going to fence it off to keep the cows out of it, and I'm going to monitor for exotic and nuisance, like Mark said. I mean, sometimes they're like that. Sometimes they're very, very simple documents.
How many people here who've been doing this work for a long time have done a regulatory conservation easement on a piece of property for mitigation and been required to have a management plan? Raise your hand. Or without a management plan, for that matter. Without a management plan.
Okay?
It's a common thing. I sat on the governing board for 9 years. Most of these people know that. You probably don't know that. But conservation easements were granted regularly, regulatory conservation easements with no management plans.
Okay?
So this is an issue that is near
Another
and
big
dear to
issue.
my heart,
Gotcha.
because if you provide a management plan and the property needs management, burning, control of exotic invasives, whatever, then it's enhancement. It's not preservation.
It could be. It could be.
No, it always is. Unless you're going to fence a piece of property off and keep the cows out and the people out, and that's it. Then I agree with that, because nothing is absolute. But most of the time, you provide a management plan on a piece of property for mitigation. You're looking for enhancement. You're not doing it for preservation. Because if you're going to do it for preservation, it's just preserve it as it is, and that's the way it works. And that's the way it has historically worked. And if you're now telling us a change, let me know, because in every mitigation bank I do from now on, I'm just going to propose preservation. It's not worth the money to do the enhancement if I'm not going to get enhancement credit.
So the value of preservation and what it prevents, right? So if I have an area and say it's one of the Carlton properties in Central Florida, they manage it pretty well. And they say, I'd like to preserve this area for mitigation for a project that I'm doing. And they've been managing it pretty well. So there's really no enhancement to do to that. So if they put a conservation easement on that, and they say, I'm going to continue to manage it like I have always done, and it's going to stay in this condition, you're telling me that that would be looked at by this district as enhancement? Or I'm trying to understand your question.
Everybody in this room knows that there's a specific example in every case on both sides of the coin,
Okay.
right? I'm not talking about a cattle ranch that somebody's improved the pasture and they mow it and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about a native system. All
So was
right?
I.
You got a native system. It's a large acreage. for the most part in general, and now I'm making generalizations myself, but for those pieces of property that are native systems and people are just running cattle on them in an unimproved pasture, they're going to burn them when they get a chance. And most of the time, a lot of the time, the weather doesn't allow them to do a regular burning. And they just don't, because they're not willing to spend the money and the effort to do the fire lanes and all that kind of stuff. So when you provide a plan that says you're going to burn it with regularity and there's going to be a fire lanes here and here and here and there wasn't before, the agency should not be able to come back and say, well, that's just preservation. Because you're expending a lot of money to improve the habitat. Over the long term, it's going to be better than it was before. And if it's better than it was before, that's enhancement. That's not preservation.
I agree that if it was better than what it was before, that is enhancement. I agree. But if your management plan is maintaining the system that is there now, to me, that's preservation. And your management plan will vary. What time is this supposed to end? Okay.
I'm sure that you won't stay a little late.
All right. Well, I didn't know if, does everybody need a break or do you want to keep going?
I think we should
Keep going?
unless someone really needs to do it.
Okay, let's go. Time lag. Accounts for time lag between functions that are lost at the impact site and when they are fully offset by mitigation. So, key thing to remember about time lag is it's from when your impact occurs to when you realize your Part 2 scores. So that's what we're talking about there. These are a few factors to think about when you look at your time lag.
Oh, and by the way, this is addressing top 10 issue number 6.
Do I need to go back to here, or is that, okay, okay.
Any time lag discussion?
Any time lag, okay. So, oh, here's a good one since we've been preservation focused. Does the time lag apply to preservation? Yes. Except for mitigation for, well, phosphate and heavy mineral mining, which, very few people in the state do, it applies. So the key point, I think, that we wanted to get across from folks is that the time lag for preservation is greater than 1 if the preservation area needs time to mature to fully offset the impacts. That's why I said you have to look at from when the impacts occur to when your Part 2 scores are realized. So it depends on what you score the end preservation game to be, scenario to be. And if it's down the road and it's significantly after your impacts, then that's what you have to look at. Sometimes, especially the things that I deal with now in the mining community, I mean, they'll go in phases, big, huge phases. So if they're preserving an area that's been, degraded or whatever it is, it needs time to mature to offset those impacts. Depends on when they're doing the impact. So that's the only thing this is telling you to do, is make sure you keep that in mind, impact to Part 2 scores. So that's key thing. And this is getting along with that. For closed canopy systems, if the community structure score is scored as 9 and the current conditions not include a canopy, what factors should be considered when assigning a time lag? So I think we went through a couple of these before. Things to consider. Obviously, forested systems are going to take a while to mature. But it's always to your Part 2 scores. Please keep that in mind. I mean, if your Part 2 scores are lower, then it might take a lot less time in order to capture those functions. All right, so don't just assume, I mean, if you're going for a 9 or a 10 or something like that, then and you've got nothing, it's going to be a while until they get there. So that's all this is saying to you. Further aspects of if the community structure is non-indicative of a mature system, then start looking at all these components. But all that is based on when your impact occurs. So it's moving. Risk, 6 factors there. And this is from a 1 to 3 in 25.25 increments. Now let's go back to that for a second. Is this addressing anything, Michelle?
Yes.
It probably is. 10? 10, all right. This is addressing top 10 issues, number 10 on the top 10 list. So you're going to look at what risks that I have related to these things and throw them into these categories. So here's one I think that was put in to kind of spur a little bit of conversation. Is this a common scenario? Yeah, here? What risks am I going to have? Who's the president of the condo association or homeowners association? What kind of fees do we have there? That sort of thing. So, no. But all these things, look into them and look at them. I think in the rule, all this is based on vulnerability. I mean, that's what you're looking at. And does anybody, as we go through the 5 factors, does anybody have any questions related to the 5 factors? Or are there any specific questions or problems that you've run into? I think you gave me a few previously. Are there any on this specifically that you can think of? No? Okay. That surprises me, but all right. Yes. Oh. And I'm trying to speed up. I'm sorry if I'm not.
On risk, do you increase an element of risk if you have required prescribed burning in perpetuity forever and ever and ever? If you're telling people they've got to mitigate in kind and they've got to do prescribed burning or some active management and HOA is going to be responsible for now and forever, just throwing that out. And then also, I would like to see the district address more often the hazards from wildfire fuel buildup, especially from upland preservation areas when you've got head-high palmetto and even some of the wetlands where you've got dense fetterbush, especially the bigger sites that would catch on fire. I think there is an allowance in the district's rules to have a management plan to manage fuel load and still have it in conservation, just more as an observation or a point to bring out in some of these presentations, because that produces an element of risk for the property owner.
Ah, okay. The answer to your first question, I think it's the one you were looking for. Does essentially, if you have a fire-dependent community and you have to burn this on a regular basis, is that something that you would consider for risk? And yes, I mean, you may or may not have the weather conditions to burn. You may not be able to get the permits to burn. I mean, all those have a little bit of risk involved in that. Everything is perfect, but I think at least DEP, from what I've seen, we have consistently at least put a little bit of risk in there because that is sort of risky going in the future. Not a whole lot if that's the only issue, but yeah, we have. Oops, sorry. So, risk. Is it ever appropriate to assign risk to preservation only? Yes. Even good quality preservation could result in an area with some threats, such as invasive exotics or insufficient prescribed fire associated with adjacent development. I think we kind of already, went through this But again, that's your management plan, that's what you're going to do. You know, how risky is it? What do you have to do to it? If it's putting a fence around it and scanning for invasive exotics, you know, not a lot of risk there, I would think. Make sure your barbed wire's intact. So, but it does apply. That's what we're saying. So management considerations. How is mitigation areas? Are we still on the same 10? Okay.
This one actually goes to issue 7 and 8.
Seven
Top
and
10
eight,
issues,
okay.
7 and 8.
Oh, here's a question right there.
Back to risk. Traditionally, preservation has been basically been considered a low-risk activity.
Pretty low, yeah.
So basically what you've just said is that everything, including just straight-up preservation, has a risk factor.
It
So
could be
basically,
a
we're
risk
not going
factor
to
of
have a
one.
risk factor of 1. We're always going to have some risk factor greater than
No,
1.
no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that you have to consider risk on preservation as well. It could be a 1. I'm not saying that it always has to be greater than 1. I'm not saying that at all.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. But you bring up a good point. People think within time lag and risk, if I have 1, then I have none of that. I mean, but you did assign a value, and that's what I'm saying here. You have to think about it and assign a value. It does apply. All right, how is a mitigation area scored where an applicant does not propose to provide a funded long-term management plan or a maintenance commitment for a mitigation area where staff has determined that long-term management or maintenance would be necessary to ensure perpetual success? Sufficient reasonable assurance has not been provided to consider this mitigation plan. So that's in 12.2.3.1b. And this was what I was getting at before, was you have to kind of solve these problems before you get there. When you get to UMAM, it's not a UMAM issue. This should have been handled before that. There's a portion in UMAM that says you essentially you cannot assign Part 2 scores. In other words, your with mitigation scores without having the reasonable assurance that the plan will work. All right. So this is what this is kind of getting at. But it's also a basis of review thing. So before you even get there, you kind of have to solve this issue. And any surprises? I know it's a common theme throughout this thing, but it's kind of true. But does everybody know where that portion is in UMAM about the Part 2 scores? I don't know if you need it or not, but I don't want to take too much time in it. So it's in 62345.500, parent 1, parent B at the end. The with mitigation assessment will be scored only when reasonable assurance has been provided that the proposed plan can be conducted. So anyway, it goes along with that. Goes along with that. So, was that it? Back one. Okay. For enhancement projects involving removal of exotic vegetation when there is no long-term management plan, once the area reaches success, no further maintenance is required to control exotics. How should the UMAM score and specifically the risk score reflect the difference between the enhancement with and without the long-term management plan? So this goes back to the invasive exotics being around the area, does it not? I think that's specifically listed in here. C, the vulnerability of the mitigation to colonization by invasive exotics or other invasive species, considering the location, the recruitment sources, stability of the site for establishment of these species, degree of which the functions provided by plant community would be affected. So they have to be addressed. If you don't address it to the management plan, what we're saying is that's an easily taken care of type of thing. So it has to be addressed. Yes.
One of the questions sometimes comes up is if you're impacting a tallow wetland, for instance, and then they're going to mitigate with the remaining tallow wetland. I guess in this situation, even here, you would say it's unacceptable mitigation from 12.2.3.
Unacceptable mitigation. I mean, is it, well, when you say that,
Because
are
it
you,
has to be, you saying it's not really a native community and it's not really unique and something that you really want to put under conservation easement.
you're talking about the importance, if they just preserve the tallow. Oh, I'm sorry.
They impacted tallow and they want to preserve the adjacent wetland, the remaining of it on the site.
That's the same tallow infested 100% type of thing? No.
Maybe not 100%, but there's quite a bit of tallow invasion, and I guess that's what I'm trying to, is that how you all would look at that, is you would not mitigate with that?
Correct. We would look back to that importance test, to those degraded native community types that we talked about before. So correct.
So they couldn't mitigate with on-site. They'd have to go to an off-site option there. Or it'd have to enhance it.
Yes.
Just
Yes.
for clarification.
Got one back there. Mark got one back there.
Yes, I'm sorry I didn't make a statement earlier about this, about the important ecosystems portion that you were just referring to, but since we've revisited it, I'd like to make a quick comment. And that is, if UMAM is in fact based on the losses and no net loss of functional value of a wetland, and we are assessed a functional value loss as a result of Sandy's scenario of an impact to a nuisance exotic species populated wetland area, that we can mitigate with an exact replica of the functions and values that are lost in that impact, how can that not be viewed as a net non-loss of wetlands in terms of both UMAM and the ERP rules?
So let me understand your question a little bit more. So you're saying that if I have whatever it is, a wet prairie of so many acres, and then a wet prairie of, or some wet prairie with so many acres of planted pine on it, and then a wet prairie with so many acres of planted pine on it, if I preserve that in perpetuity exactly as it is now, why would that not be a functional offset?
It's simply the definition of preservation. That is, you're protecting that area from future from future loss as a result of potential impact.
Right, future degradation.
The credit is given for preservation every day, and that's not the improvement that occurs to the functions and values of that area, but instead the protection afforded to that area from losses to those functions and values in the future. So in this case, call it whatever ratio you want to call it. Let's call it an acre of impact to the tallow infested area and the provision of 100 acres of additional tallow area that you will guarantee will no longer be impacted and no more functions will ever be lost from those areas that might otherwise be lost. Does that not offset those functions and values? I mean, I guess unless this goes back to the important ecosystems argument. Pine plantation, we impact it around here every day. Every project I know of impacts a little bit of wet jurisdictional pine plantation. Those pine plantations are typically assessed at anywhere between 50 to 70% functional value of a regular wetland. I mean, of an optimal wetland that would have normally been there. It's just the way the scores are made. And yet at the same time, wetland preservation of these pine plantation community types is thrown out as consideration, even though those functions and values could be provided under that preservation in their current condition in perpetuity. And I just don't understand the differences in the approach on both sides of the UMAM equation.
Okay. And we're talking about wetlands here, not uplands, right? Wetlands, okay. No, the important ecosystems aspect is still there. I mean, it just is. And like I said before, you know, preservation is supposed to be really, I mean, it's high values. I mean, we've come down to a ratio of, 61, 10 to 1, that kind of, if you want to go back to your ratio days before UMAM. And the core, I think, is said at least in some cases it can be considered now. I think it lightened it up, didn't it, a little bit? Right, right. Right. It has more consideration than before. But in certain circumstances, I think is what your rule said or something like that. It's a conditional type of thing. But anyway, I mean.
Oh, hold on now.
Oh.
We got started.
I'm sorry, I was prompting you too without a mic. I should do that.
I'm Bev Lawrence, and I'm with the Corps of Engineers, and it's on a case-by-case basis as far as giving credit for preservation only, but that's kind of our lowest in our hierarchy, but we still make sure people come up with some kind of a plan because of the new mitigation rule. Does that make sense?
I mean, traditionally, the preservation has always taken a very hard line. I mean, it's always been that way. We've been supposed to be very selective in what we want as preservation, because as an agency, now I'm taking over the responsibility of doing compliance on that thing, of devoting staff and resources and everything else. I mean, it's always had to have this important ecosystem aspect to it. So.
I have a point of clarification. Are you saying then that for thank you, the planted pine plantation, you get no credit for preserving it?
I'm saying that in most cases, that would not be an important ecosystem. I think we went back to it, wherever that was.
Because the district staff has viewed that, especially if it's not bedded, that the pines are just happen to be in rows.
I know.
So why is this? You're punishing the silviculture industry. They've devalued the property. I mean, it just doesn't make any logical sense to me why you get no credit. If anything, it's highly susceptible to continued silviculture. So there's more of a threat to disturbance than the deeper swamp. You should give it a higher PAF because there's a greater risk of adverse impacts. It's a way of getting people to convert pine plantation into natural pine wetlands, on the cheap.
I don't know if I fully understand your point, but...
Pine plantations have most of the wetland functions as the pine flatwoods, especially if they're not bedded. The pines just happen to be in rows.
Okay.
So I think it's unfair not to give people credit for preserving them the way they are.
So
And there's a greater threat to impacts from continued silviculture than there is from most other forested wetlands because they're actively managed. So if anything, you should give more credit.
And you're assuming this is a hydric pine flatwood?
Yes.
And it was a hydric pine flatwood?
It was, yes. And the difference is the pines are now happen to be in rows versus scattered.
Okay. Ground cover?
I just see a disconnect in the logic. I don't understand why.
What about
on the
ground
one hand,
cover?
you assess impacts, and they've got so much functions. You go to preserve it. We're not going to give you any credit because we want to see it converted back into a hydric pine flatwood, so you have to enhance it.
Well,
I really have a problem with that.
Well, my experience with well, again, it depends on if it's uplands or wetlands.
It's wetlands.
So
there's thousands, tens of thousands of acres of what historically, there's very little natural hydric pine flatwoods left in northeast Florida. Most of it's converted to pine plantation. So what you're telling people now is you've got to go in and do an active enhancement plan. We're going to assess risk. More than likely what's going to happen is the enhancement will stop at some point in time and it'll just revegetate into a mixture of fire-suppressed pines and hardwoods.
Well, that has to do with your risk and your management plan as well.
Yeah. I mean, saying 500 years from now, I doubt the district will be here.
I certainly won't care at that point, no.
It just doesn't make sense, that you don't give credit for preserving pine plantation. When they look at the functions for the impact, they assess it just about like it's a natural pine flatwood. You're getting it both ways. You really do. I mean, I've made that argument before. All the functions are screwed up, and they said, well, unless it's really bedded up badly, it's just the pines are in rows and it's just a temporal thing. They
What-
harvest it on a certain cycle.
Right, what's your ground cover like?
Again, if it's not bedded, it's usually pretty well, natural. Might be fire suppressed.
Okay.
You might have more gallberry than what you normally would have.
Because those are really the driving factors of those types of systems that you're talking about.
On what?
On your functions.
I'm still not getting why you don't give credit for preserving pine plantation wetlands. When you assess the full impact score.
Well, I
You
guess
just- I mean, what is the change now? We've got to do enhancement?
I'm missing something. What am I missing, Mark?
I might be misunderstanding it, but it
Okay.
sounded like unless you're preserving a natural habitat, you've got to go back and do all this work to
Unless-
make it into this nice, pristine area, and then we'll give you credit. So you've really enhanced the area, and you'll get preservation credit for it.
Oh, no, you would get
Is that
enhancement. Yeah, you would get enhancement.
But you don't give preservation credit for preserving hydric pine plantation?
We would say it's not an important ecosystem. We don't want that for preservation.
What if it's tens of thousands of acres bordering large drainage ways? That's significant.
Well, then I think, does the size of the thing matter? I think we said, typically not, but yeah, it may.
I just
It may.
think putting pines in the rows
If you're talking
is
about
insignificant.
huge, I don't know about that.
In a lot of places, you have the ground covers all still pretty much there, the hydrology's still there. You just have rows of pines versus scattered natural pines.
Okay, so
And
you're,
they're just wiping out all the preservation credit.
so what you're saying is that if I assess that, or the district or whoever is assessing that, they're assessing it on an impact. They're not calling that a highly degraded system.
No.
Does that therein lie the problem? Part of
Yeah,
it.
you have 1 acre that's assessed at a 0.6.
Okay,
And then you go, okay, I convert my normal 1 point of lift and a PAF, and I'll preserve this much hydric pine plantation. And now under kind of this new interpretation that may have been applied everywhere else in the state, but now you're saying that's not good, that's not natural.
it's not an important ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, you can get in there maybe with a bush hog and thin out those pines and say, okay, now it looks somewhat more natural. But
So-
there's no way people are going to go in and start doing prescribed burn plans in their subdivision. It's not going to happen.
So in other
And I
words,
think
you're,
we're asking them to do an ongoing mowing program from now to the end of time is not going to happen either.
so your scenario is that your ground cover is intact. They didn't do bedded in rows. They don't have 800 or 900 trees per acre. They don't have the, classic
It's not shaded out
industrial
to the point where it's
use.
pine needles. I mean, there's a lot of that.
Okay. And so when I think of pine plantation, I'm thinking they herbicided it, they bedded and furrowed and all these things. But you're telling me you have somewhere where they planted pines and that all they did was take the 50 pine trees that were there and they made them all into rows. Other than that, there's absolutely no difference.
There's many places I know of. Or even the bedding. I mean, the district, we make arguments all the time. Let us flatten out the beds. They'll provide a lift for hydrology. And the argument we get back is, a lot of times, if the beds aren't that high, over time, they'll just tend to slough in and it just even out. So you get no enhancement credit.
Okay.
And now you're saying, well, we'll give you enhancement credit. In other words, up until now, it's been argued it's just altered mainly from the vegetation and the fact that it can be timbered periodically.
Okay.
There are many places where if you had it bedded up, anywhere from 18 inches or even higher, that it has significantly changed the sheet flow patterns, and I could see enhancement there. But I just think it's unfair where the only change has been that's planted in rows of pines that you won't give them credit for preserving it. And then trying to apply this fire management, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
Well,
The
then-
liability and the risk.
Well, then are you preserving a hydric pine or are you preserving something else? What are your Part 2 scores and what's your target community?
It would be like in northern St. Johns County off of 210, where you've got hundreds of feet of wet pine plantation behind people's lots, and they're preserving that. They're not going to get in there, more than likely, forever and ever and ever, and be doing prescribed burning, or even doing the mechanized mowing. I think at some point in time, that's going to stop. And what will happen, it will just naturally vegetate into whatever it's going to be, a mature stand of pine and mixed hardwoods.
Hardwoods.
Yeah. So I think just leaving it alone and let it grow in whatever it's going to be. Only manage the fuel load if it poses a wildfire hazard. But I don't think the HOA 200 years from now is still going to have their mowing guy out there mowing out in those pine woods.
Yeah, never know. But anyway, so is that your target community that you're saying this is my Part 2 scores are based off of? Is that?
It kind of plays off on one of the staff's comments. You impact Chinese tallow wetland, you should get credit for preserving Chinese tallow wetland. You impact hydric pine plantation, you should get credit for preserving hydric pine plantation. When it's going to continue to be managed if you don't give them any credit for preserving it. They'll carve it out of the project and leave it with the timber company. It's like, to me, I mean, honestly, it seems like a way of forcing people and doing this nice ecological restoration back into natural communities and development sites. Maybe it's appropriate on mitigation banks, but not in developments.
No, preservation has always been the preservation of important ecosystems. I mean, it has always been that way. I don't know how to explain it otherwise.
But there's a disconnect in your logic on how you can assess impacts to hydric pine plantation and then not give credit for preserving it because it's altered.
That's not disconnect my logic. Essentially, I don't know what they're doing as far as impact scores. If they're valuing that as a
It's essentially natural.
You know, what are they part oneing that thing? And
I mean,
and then what are they degrading
some degradation, but it's not. It's your, the vegetation score is not a 9 or a 10.
Because what you're telling me is that staff has been looking at that as not a degraded system. They're saying that is essentially a native community.
Yes.
I mean, that's what you're telling me.
In fact, they've told me in the past on some projects, put it down as a 625 instead of a 441W, a wetland pine plantation. We're going to look at it as kind of like a hydric pine flatwood.
Okay. So I guess
old. I mean, that's what I remember.
This is a question for me. Because when I think about pine plantations, I'm thinking 800 or 900 trees per acre, that sort of thing. But I think his point is that you haven't been assessing these and scoring them and thus determining that these are degraded systems on some of them. Is that the point? I think that's your point.
I'm not sure that I understand, but we have been looking at pine plantations as a non-native disturbed community, and we've looked back to see what the community would have been historically, and that would be the target community, whatever the historical native community would be. In many cases, it has been either a wet flatwoods or it has been a hardwood system that was harvested and converted to pine plantation.
Okay. I guess the key for me is is it a native community that is degraded? I mean, because you can have, some impacts to a system, I'll just say that. Some things to fix that your management plan will address. I mean, I think that can be included in your preservation aspect. Now, at what point does that become enhancement? I think that's where you have to kind of work it out to where it will be.
Because I've proposed enhancement in the past and they shot it down. They said just preserve it.
Okay.
And now you're saying we can't preserve it, it's not natural.
So what is your definition? But again, I'm going back to two different things. Pine plantation, to me, is bedded, furrowed, a lot of trees in there. You're telling me that this is where they've done seeding or something like that in there?
There's a lot of hydric pine plantations where the rows of pines are spaced far enough apart where it still functions essentially as a hydric pine flatwood.
All right.
I mean, you could get in there and thin the pines out and call it a hydric pine flatwood. But they either give us credit for wetland enhancement with knocking down whatever beds there are and thinning the pines out, which they really haven't done much of that in the past.
Okay, I think that's what we're saying is, well, If that's an enhancement project, then that's what you'd be doing. But you're telling me two different things. You're telling me, one, that when I compare it to my optimal native community type, this in some of these particular scenarios, they are not degraded. I mean, that's what you're telling me, even though
they had not given enhancement credit in the past because they would call it temporary.
Okay.
We're not going to give you all this lift for flattening beds down because, you know, they'll just wash out after a period of time. The planting in rows isn't that big of a deal. I mean, that's my experience when I've proposed enhancement in the past to enhance pine plantation wetlands. They're like, it's kind of natural, and these impacts are temporary.
Okay.
So if you're going to now give a bunch of enhancement credit, we can do that all day long.
You're not going to get credit because it's not a natural community.
Well, that's what I keep going back to is, you know, what is your baseline? What is your part one? What's your optimal native community type? But you want to say something?
Well, no, basically what you're describing is an enhancement. You are describing enhancement. If you're going to go in and thin out pine plantation, flatten the rows.
That's enhancement to me. That's enhancement to me.
I proposed it in the past, and I just said, I'm not going to give you credit.
Okay.
I think it was said a little bit earlier, but I think the root of this is the initial evaluation for impact is fairly high, and the consideration for mitigation is extremely low. They're not comparable. That's the root that creates the issue that Byron's been talking about for 10 minutes.
Okay.
And I think we can get together and figure out a solution to that, because there should not, what's good for the goose should be good for the gander, and it's not.
Okay. Right, it's your optimal native community type. I mean, you know, so to me, that's enhancement what you're doing. I think the last slide was uniqueness and all that. I think we've already kind of covered that in the interest of time. You know, when I became the UMAM guy years ago, you know, I asked Connie and Clark Hall and them why that uniqueness box was in there on Part 1 form. And they said because it's important, and Clark kind of said it's important. I said, well, I understand that, but isn't that, to me, that's a basis of review appropriateness issue. By the time I get to UMAM, all that's been settled, and it's not like I'm doubling or tripling the scores. You know what I mean? If I have a unique system. So, in other words, it has no bearing on the Part 2 scores, does it not? It just doesn't, it's not in there. So it doesn't affect your scores whatsoever. And I know if you know, on the Part 1 form that if you put, yes, this is a unique ecosystem, a lot of processors look at it and go, oh my gosh, it's unique. You know, now what? And really that should be addressed, like I said before, all day long. It should be addressed before you even get to UMAM. So anyway.
Does anybody have any other questions? Okay. Whether they're specific to this topic or an earlier one or a new one.
Two questions. The last time we had a UMAM workshop was 4 years ago. And so I would hope that if there may be some more often intervals, more close together intervals besides once every 4 years. And then the second question is, I'm sure there's going to, well, I would assume there'd be some policy guidance as a result of this, maybe on the district and the DEP, and if there is, if they could get that out to the consultants so that we could know what to anticipate in the future.
Absolutely.
I can address that, yes, to both questions. Yeah, there will be some additional training coming up, and it will not be 4 years between. And yes, there will be some guidance, and when those policies, or non-rule policies, I guess, however we want to call them, are going to be out, they will be given. What's that? Yeah, no, not policies, guidance, I said. Didn't I say guidance? I didn't say policy. Yeah, guidance documents. Yes, yeah. So, yes to both your questions. Okay, yes, guidance.
I have a question about scoring community structure.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, we have a cypress dome, right, and it's been logged. So we're supposed to score it with envisioning that it comes back to its natural form unless there's a flood change. If it's left alone in its natural state. Is that true?
Right, the key issue there is UMAM says, it asks you the question, have the normal successional patterns been altered? And I think that's what I would look at there. Usually in the wetlands that I've looked at that have been impacted by silviculture, say, after you get after they've been tiger striped a number of times or cleared a number of times, even if you follow the BMPs, after a while you're going to see this community change, start to happen, through the skidder trails and, the furrows that they leave and through the tiger striping and that sort of thing. So you'll see slight community structure changes, but you want to ask yourself, is that permanently altered or will it recover? So, because a project I'm thinking of, bay system, fire ran through it, little wind tornado action there, knocked things down. From what we can tell is the normal successional patterns have not been altered there. So we would say this is kind of a normal, natural resetting of the system that happened.
So you score it as if it's really going to come back to its natural state, as if you see it a few years from now and it's intact, basically.
Right. Yeah. If you see nothing that has changed the normal successional patterns that are going on there, then yeah, it's doing what it's supposed to do.
Okay. Well, by the same token, what if, for instance, I have a mitigation area? Let's say it's in year 3 of it being mitigated. Let's see it doesn't have any exotics, or it's coming back and the vegetation is doing fine, everything's surviving, the survival rate is great, then can I also score it then high, assuming that it's going to be left alone in its state?
If you have just so I understand your question. So you gave a permit already? You said it's in year 3. So I gave a permit.
Yeah, well, you have a mitigation. Let's say you do have to score the mitigation. Let's have a scenario that you do have to score it, and it's for this community structure,
okay,
as it currently is. And it's going to be left alone. Couldn't you score it in the same manner then? That it's going to come back to what it's supposed to be if it's doing fine now?
Oh, you're getting at the risk issue? Timeline, okay. All right. So you're looking at timeline and risk. Depends on, again, it depends on what functions you're trying to offset, because that time lag is from the time that you have the impact to the time that function is back. Is that your question?
Well, sort of. I'm just trying to say if we're looking at if we're looking at a community that we're saying is degraded right now, but I'm supposed to picture it sometime in the future as if it's going to come back to its natural state, and the functions haven't been lost. Let's say hydrologically it's fine. Let's say it's a hurricane that came through, like you said,
right,
and it's going to come back to its natural state. Then how come? Well, if I do have a mitigation area, then why can't I score it, for its community structure that it's going to come back to its natural state? Or how does it affect its, the time lag then? How would it play into it then? Like, why can't I score it in the same way then? That it's doing fine right now. There's no exotics. The survival rate is just fine. It's meeting the success criteria. Then why can I score it then, as if it's coming back just fine?
Yeah, so in other words, your wetland, you can see that the normal successional patterns have not been altered. There's nothing currently that you can see that this thing is going to turn into something else.
That's right.
Right. And so I have a wetland that somebody clear cut, I guess. Is that a scenario that you were thinking of? Okay.
We can pick either the hurricane or the clear cut.
Yeah, okay, or a hurricane. And so somebody says, I want to preserve this wetland, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And right now it's in that reset stage where, my bay trees have fallen over and that sort of thing. And so, and as they're impacting what, a mature bay system?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so, in the rule it says you have to look at your functions and what you offset and what you didn't. And you're going to envision in your mind how long it will take for those bay trees to reach the level of function that your impact is, and that's your time lag between those two.
Well, that's the thing. I was told to basically envision that the functions, it's functioning just like it should function, although there's a lot of trees that are down.
Mm-hmm. It's doing whatever it is it's supposed to do. Normal
Exactly.
successional patterns haven't changed. It's still a bay system.
I guess that's where the argument comes in, whether or not it's...
It depends on the
function is
functions
the
you're
way-
offsetting, yes.
I think what she's, I don't know if I've got this right, but I think what she's asking is why in the impact scenario do you look at it as if the timbering activity had not occurred or the whatever alteration activity had occurred, the temporary effect? Do you not take that into consideration when you're talking about the mitigation part of it? You're going to score that at whatever it is today to get it to an 8 or whatever it is to offset that impact with time, lag, and risk. I think she's asking why in one scenario you ask me to not take into consideration
Exactly.
what activity has occurred to it. In the other situation, you're saying, well, the same activity's occurred here, but now you're saying it's a 2, and I've got to get it to an 8 with time, lag, and risk.
Okay.
I think that's what she's asking.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's true.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, essentially, it's an ERP question looking at the functions again.
I just trying to clarify the question.
Gotcha. I mean, and that's what it is. I mean, because regardless of the score of wetlands or anything else, you're asking yourself in the timeline factor if the functions that I need are incorporated in this mature closed canopy system, and I'm preserving this, but it's going to, and I see nothing wrong with it. It's eventually going to get there. What's the time lag, if you will, between those two states? And I'll just might need a little bit more of this to get there, because you're looking at the functional area comes into a play with the functional assessment, and you're looking at, but you're looking solely at the functions to there. Now you could have an impact to your bay system that in this particular bay system that you're impacting doesn't have that full suite of functions, and your cutover system could provide all of those functions. It really goes back to when you lose the functions and when you get them back.
Thank you.
Yeah. I hope I answered. I can talk to you later on if that
Yeah,
helps.
sure,
Okay. Well, this has been fun. What do you think? Yeah?
Does anybody have any other questions or comments or anything like that for Calvin? No? Okay. All right, well, thank you all for coming, and hopefully this has provided a little assistance, and we're going to have this online, hopefully within the next week or two, the slide presentation along with the discussion. So,
All right,
thanks
thank
for
you
coming.
all. Thank you all. Please email me if you have any questions. Or email them and they'll bring it to me.